true scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. It was a Christmas Eve like no other, one that still sends chills down my spine whenever I recall it. My wife and I had just finished decorating the tree when we noticed something bizarre outside our living room window. A man dressed as Santa Claus, his suit tattered and dirty, was standing in our backyard, swaying back and forth in a slow, eerie dance. First, we thought it was some kind of prank, but the longer we watched, the more unsettling it became. His movements were hypnotic, repetitive, and deeply disturbing. He never spoke, never looked up, just kept dancing under the dim glow of the streetlight, his shadow casting a haunting figure on the snow-covered ground. My heart raced as I debated whether to confront him or call the police. But before I could decide, something in his dance changed. It became frantic, almost desperate, as if he was being controlled by some unseen force. We decided to stay inside, locking all the doors and closing the blinds, hoping he would go away. But even with the curtains drawn, I could still sense his presence out there, like a chilling specter haunting our home. Hours passed, and when I finally gathered the courage to peek outside, he was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The next morning, the local news reported a strange and mysterious death in the neighborhood. A man had been found lifeless just a few blocks away, his body contorted in a way that defied explanation. The police were baffled. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries, just a look of sheer terror frozen on his face. My mind immediately flashed back to the man in the Santa suit. Could it be connected? The thought was as chilling as it was absurd, but something deep inside told me this was no coincidence. As the days went by, the incident began to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake the image of that eerie dance, the haunting way he seemed to move with purpose, yet without any apparent reason. I tried to rationalize it, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together. The man who died had lived alone, just like us, and had no known family or friends. It was as if he had been marked, just like we were. I started researching, trying to find any explanation for what we had witnessed. Combed through old newspapers, online forums, anything that could shed light on the mystery. That's when I stumbled upon an old legend from our town's history, a story about a cursed Santa suit that drove its wearer to madness and death. The legend was vague, but the similarities were too eerie to ignore. My wife thought I was becoming obsessed. Maybe I was, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know if what we saw was real or just some sick coincidence. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, the lights flickered, and I felt a cold draft sweep through the room. I turned to the window, and there, in the reflection, I saw him again. A man in the Santa suit, swaying to the same haunting rhythm. But this time, he wasn't outside. He was right behind me. My heart stopped as I spun around, only to find the room empty. The air heavy with an eerie silence. I knew then that whatever had taken that man's life was not finished. The haunting wasn't over. It had only just begun. We decided to leave the house, but as we packed our things, I found a piece of red fabric stuck in the doorframe, like a chilling reminder that we could never truly escape. We moved out that night, leaving behind everything we owned. The house was sold to a new family, and I prayed they would never experience what we had. But even now, years later, every Christmas, I can't help but feel a cold shiver run down my spine when I see a Santa suit. I wonder if the curse has found a new victim, or if it's still waiting, biding its time until the next dance. The experience left a permanent mark on me, a scar that no amount of time can heal. I've learned to live with the fear, but I'll never forget the horror of that Christmas Eve. And so, every year, as the holiday season approaches, I warn others to be wary, to stay vigilant, because sometimes, the things that seem most innocent and hide the most chilling secret. I've driven that remote road countless times, always at night, always alone, but this time was different. Something felt off from the moment I turned onto it. The mist rolled in thick and fast, wrapping the car in a suffocating blanket of white. I could barely see the headlights, let alone the road ahead. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as an eerie chill settled over the car, creeping into my bones. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the fog. A woman, standing dead center in the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded, tires screeching against the wet pavement, before it spun out of control. Everything happened so fast. One minute I was swerving to avoid her, the next I was upside down, the car crushed around me, my mind a blur of pain and fear. I should have been dead. The crash was brutal, the kind that usually makes headlines with words like fatal and tragic. Somehow, I was still alive, trapped in the wreckage, but alive. That's when I saw her again, standing just beyond the shattered windshield, her face half hidden in the fog. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with eyes that seemed to pierce right through my soul. There was something haunting about her gaze, something that told me she wasn't of this world. I tried to call out, but my voice was nothing more than a rasp, caught in my throat. Panic set in as I realized I was losing blood, fast. My vision blurred. I could still see her, as clear as day, slowly walking toward me, her steps almost floating over the ground. As she drew closer, I noticed the dark stains on her dress, the way her skin seemed to glow with a ghostly pallor. Then it hit me. This wasn't the first time someone had crashed on this road. I'd heard the stories, the whispers about a ghostly figure that appeared in the mist, leading drivers to their doom. But I'd always brushed them off as urban legend, until now. She knelt beside the car, her cold hand reaching through the broken glass to touch my cheek. The moment she made contact, a wave of memories flooded my mind, flashes of another life, another crash. I saw her, younger, alive, terrified as she lost control of her car on this very road. The impact, the fire, the darkness that followed. It was her, same woman, trapped in a loop of death and despair. I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened, her fingers icy against my skin. I could feel my life slipping away, drained by her touch. It was as if she was taking my place, ready to live again while I would take her spot in the endless cycle of death. Fog thickened around us, the world fading into a chilling void. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the terror in my mind. But just when I thought it was over, she let go. Her face softened, a look of sorrow and regret passing over her features. Fog began to lift, the world slowly coming back into focus. I was still alive, but the crash had taken its toll. As I lay there waiting for help, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been given a second chance, one that came at a cost. When the paramedics arrived, they were shocked I'd survived. The car was a mangled mess, kind you'd expect to pull a corpse from, not a living person. They said it was a miracle, but I knew better. I'd met death on that road, and she'd decided to let me go. But not without a warning. Chilling reminder that life is fragile, and sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. Now every time I drive that road, I can still feel her presence, watching, waiting. The final ride isn't something you can easily forget, and I know that one day I might not be so lucky. The ghost in the fog still haunts me, a lingering shadow that reminds me how close I came to becoming her next victim. Diving has always been my escape, a way to disconnect from the chaos of life. But the dive that day was different. The water was unusually cold, even for the deep sea, and the visibility was poor. As I descended into the underwater cave, an eerie silence surrounded me, broken only by the sound of my breathing. The walls of the cave seemed to close in on me, narrowing with each kick of my fins. I had explored countless underwater caves before, but this one had a haunting presence that I couldn't shake. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until my flashlight was the only thing cutting through the thick, black water. And that's when I saw it. An opening that led into a vast, cavernous chamber. It was both inviting and foreboding, and my curiosity got the better of me. As I swam through the entrance, a strange current tugged at me, pulling me deeper into the cave. The chamber was massive, with walls that disappeared into the darkness. But what really caught my attention were the shadows, faint, almost imperceptible figures drifting just beyond the edge of my light. They seemed to move with the current, gliding silently through the water, their forms distorted and ghostly. My heart raced as I realized these weren't just shadows. They were divers, or at least, they had been. Their bodies were twisted and unnatural, as if they had been trapped here for years. Their equipment rusted and decayed. Panic set in as I tried to backtrack, but the current had shifted, pushing me deeper into the chamber. My breathing grew faster, my oxygen running low. I knew I had to stay calm. The sight of those haunting figures was impossible to ignore. They floated around me, their lifeless eyes staring through me, as if trying to communicate some terrible secret. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, my limbs growing heavy, and a deep, primal fear began to take hold. This cave was a graveyard, and I was about to become its next victim. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I spotted something. A narrow passageway that seemed to lead back to the surface. With the last of my strength, I swam toward it, the shadows closing in around me. My lungs burned, every breath a struggle, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. I could see the light from the entrance, faint but growing brighter with each kick. The shadows clawed at me, trying to pull me back into the darkness, but I fought with everything I had. Just as my vision began to fade, I broke through the surface, gasping for air. The sunlight hit my face, warm and welcoming, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those cold, dead eyes watching me from below. Back on the boat, I tried to calm down, but my mind kept replaying what I'd seen. Those divers had been real, or at least they had been at some point. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't supposed to find that chamber. It was a place of death, where the lost souls of the deep waited for their next victim. I had narrowly escaped, but I knew I would never dive again without feeling that same chilling dread. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see them, drifting through the water, their arms outstretched, reaching for me. The last breath I took in that cave wasn't just a breath of air. It was a breath of life, snatched back from the jaws of death. And it serves as a haunting reminder that the sea holds secrets that are better left undisturbed. When my grandmother called me to her bedside, I knew something was wrong. She was frail, her voice barely a whisper, but her eyes were sharp with urgency. She made me promise something that day, something I didn't fully understand at the time. "Take care of the old house," she said, her hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "There's a secret there, one that must never be forgotten." I nodded, thinking it was just the ramblings of a woman at the end of her life, but I promised all the same. After her funeral, I found myself standing in front of the old house she had spoken of. Crumbling, eerie relic of a bygone era. It had been in our family for generations, but no one had lived there in years. As I walked through the creaking front door, a wave of unease washed over me, as if the house itself was warning me to leave. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Floors groaned under my weight, and the walls were lined with old, faded portraits of ancestors long dead. There was something chilling about those pictures, the way their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved from room to room. But it wasn't until I reached the attic that I truly understood the gravity of my grandmother's dying words. The attic was a time capsule, filled with old trunks, furniture covered in white sheets, and cobwebs that stretched from corner to corner. But in the far corner, hidden beneath a tattered old blanket, was a small, locked chest. My heart raced as I approached it, the key my grandmother had given me burning a hole in my pocket. With trembling hands, I unlocked the chest and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a neat, flowing script that I recognized as my grandmother's. But the more I read, the more I realized these letters weren't meant for me. They were addressed to someone else. Someone who had died long before I was born. Letters spoke of love, betrayal, and a terrible secret that had been buried along with the family's dark past. As I read on, a chilling realization dawned on me. The secret my grandmother had been so desperate to protect was one of murder. She had covered up a death, one that had taken place in this very house. The victim's ghost, she wrote, still haunted the old house, unable to find peace until the truth was revealed. The weight of my promise pressed down on me, as I realized I was now part of this deadly legacy. I spent the next few days uncovering the truth, piecing together the story from the fragments of my grandmother's letters. The victim had been a distant relative, a young woman who had been wronged by the family. Her death had been ruled an accident, but the letters made it clear that it was anything but. The more I uncovered, the more I felt her presence in the house, cold, eerie feeling that followed me everywhere I went. One night, as I was going through the last of the letters, I heard a sound, a soft, ghostly whisper that sent chills down my spine. It was as if she was speaking to me, urging me to finish what I had started. I followed the sound to the basement, where I found an old, crumbling wall. The whispers grew louder as I began to tear at the bricks, until finally I uncovered a small, hidden room. Inside was a skeleton, wrapped in the remnants of a blood-stained dress. The air was thick with the smell of death, and I knew I had found her. My heart pounded as I realized what I had to do. The only way to end this haunting was to bring the truth to light. I called the police, and they confirmed what I already knew. The skeleton belonged to the woman in the letters. The case was reopened, and the family's dark secret was finally exposed. But even after the truth came out, the house remained haunted. I could still feel her presence, watching, waiting. My grandmother's deathbed promise had been fulfilled, but it came at a cost. The house had claimed another victim, me. I couldn't leave, couldn't escape the chilling grip it had on me. The secret was out, but the haunting was far from over. The old house still stands, a haunting reminder of the family's dark past. And I, too, remain, trapped by the promise I made, bound to the house by the ghosts of the past. The deathbed promise wasn't just a request. It was a curse, one that I will carry with me to my grave. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't. One minute I was sitting at my desk, and the next, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the worried faces of my family. The doctor told me I had suffered a massive heart attack, a near-death experience that should have claimed my life. Somehow, I had pulled through. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. My heart, once a steady rhythm of life, now felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me anymore. It wasn't just the physical scars that bothered me. It was the strange, eerie sensation that accompanied every beat. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a side effect of the trauma I had endured. But then I started hearing it, a second heartbeat, faint and distant, echoing in my chest like a ghostly drum. It was as if my heart wasn't beating alone, as if someone else's life was entwined with mine. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to dismiss. It wasn't just in my head, it was real. I began to investigate, trying to find a logical explanation. I pored over medical journals, talked to doctors, but no one could explain what I was experiencing. The second heartbeat wasn't something they could hear or detect, but I knew it was there. It was chilling, this constant reminder that something was wrong, that my life was no longer entirely my own. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard it again, louder than ever, pounding in my ears like a relentless drumbeat. It was then that the memories started to surface, flashes of a past life that wasn't mine. I saw a man, a stranger, lying on an operating table, his heart failing, his life slipping away. And then I realized with a horrifying clarity, the heartbeat wasn't mine, it was his. The man had died on the operating table, his heart stopping for good, but somehow his life force had clung to mine, a lingering presence that refused to let go. I could feel his anger, his desperation, his need for justice. He had been murdered, his death covered up as a medical failure, and now he was using me to reveal the truth. The thought was as terrifying as it was absurd, but the heartbeat didn't lie. As the days went on, the visions became more frequent. more vivid. I saw his killer. An old friend who had betrayed him poisoned him to cover up a dark secret. The betrayal was brutal, heart-wrenching, and it fueled the haunting beat in my chest. The man's spirit was relentless, pushing me to confront the killer, to bring him to justice. But how could I? I was just a man who had barely escaped death himself. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I tracked down the friend, now an old man himself, living in a small, secluded town. Confronting him was the hardest thing I had ever done, but the second heartbeat urged me on, giving me the strength I needed. When I finally stood before him, I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew why I was there. The guilt had been eating away at him for years, and now it had come back to haunt him. Confessed everything. The murder, the lies, cover-up. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. The second heartbeat, once so loud and insistent, began to fade, growing quieter with each passing moment. The man's spirit, finally at peace, was leaving me, moving on to wherever souls go when their work is done. As I left the old man's house, I could feel my heart beating strong and steady, for the first time since the heart attack. The haunting was over, but the experience had left a mark on me that would never fade. I had carried another man's life with me, felt his pain, his anger, his need for justice. And now, though he was gone, his memory would live on in my heart, a silent reminder of the power of life, death, and the ties that bind us. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, chance for my friends and me to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of city life. We had chosen a remote trail in the mountains, one that promised breathtaking views and the kind of solitude we all crave. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, fresh air, and the sound of our laughter echoing through the trees. But as night fell, something in the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog rolled in, shrouding the forest in an eerie, ghostly silence. We set up camp, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling that had settled over us, but it was hard to ignore. The woods felt alive, as if they were watching us, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as we were about to call it a night, we realized one of us was missing. Jake, the most experienced hiker among us, had wandered off to gather firewood and hadn't returned. At first, we thought he was playing a prank. It was just like him to try and spook us. But as the minutes turned into hours, our worry grew. We called out for him, our voices swallowed by the fog. There was no response. The night stretched on, cold and silent, and fear began to creep in. The next morning, we split up to search for him, our hearts pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The forest was dense, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels, and the fog still clung to the ground, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. We called Jake's name until our throats were raw, but the only answer was the haunting echo of our own voices. As the day wore on, I stumbled upon something chilling. Jake's backpack, abandoned in the middle of the trail. It was torn, as if by some wild animal, but there was no blood, no sign of a struggle. Just the eerie silence of the woods. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Had he been attacked? Was he injured, lost, or worse? The fear that had been gnawing at me since last night now took hold, a cold, unshakable dread. We regrouped, and I showed the others what I had found. The sight of the torn backpack sent a wave of panic through us all. But we couldn't give up, not yet. We continued searching, pushing deeper into the forest, but with every step, it became clear that we were losing hope. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, a labyrinth of trees and shadows that swallowed our calls for help. Then, just as the sun began to set, we found him. Or at least, we found what was left of him. Jake was standing at the edge of a clearing, his back to us, staring into the distance. Relief washed over us as we called out to him, but he didn't respond. As we got closer, that relief turned to horror. Jake's face was pale, his eyes vacant, as if he wasn't really there. He looked like a man who had seen something beyond comprehension, something that had stolen his very soul. When we finally reached him, he turned to us slowly, his movements unnaturally stiff. There was something wrong, something eerie and haunting in his expression. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge us, just kept staring into the distance, his breath shallow and irregular. It was as if he had become part of the forest, a ghost of the man we once knew. We tried to snap him out of it, but he was unresponsive, lost in whatever nightmare had claimed him. We had no choice but to lead him back to camp, where he sat by the fire, staring blankly into the flames. That night, none of us slept. The forest was alive with sounds, branches snapping, whispers in the wind, but it was Jake's silent presence that terrified us the most. The next morning, we decided to leave. Jake wouldn't move. He just sat there, as if rooted to the spot. The look in his eyes was haunting, filled with a fear that seemed to go beyond anything we could understand. We had no choice but to carry him out. But as we reached the trailhead, he suddenly broke free, running back into the woods with a speed and agility that defied his earlier catatonia. We tried to follow, but he disappeared into the fog, swallowed by the forest. We searched for hours, but he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. The authorities combed the area, but they never found a trace of him. It was as if the forest had taken him, claimed him as its own. To this day, I still hear his name in the wind, a chilling reminder of the friend we lost to the wilderness. Swimming had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of the world and find peace in the rhythmic motion of the water. That day, the lake looked calm and inviting, its surface smooth as glass under the midday sun. But as I waded in, a sudden chill ran down my spine, feeling I couldn't quite shake. The locals had always whispered about the lake being haunted, but I had never paid much attention to those stories, until now. I swam out to the middle, where the water was deep and dark, almost black. The stillness around me was eerie, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against my skin. But then, something changed. Current, strong and unnatural, tugged at my legs, pulling me down with a force that took my breath away. Panic set in as I struggled to stay afloat, but the harder I fought, the stronger the current became. Within seconds, I was underwater, my arms flailing as I tried to break free from the invisible grip that held me. The cold enveloped me, and my lungs screamed for air as I sank deeper and deeper. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a distant memory that I couldn't reach. Just as I was about to give in, a pair of hands, cold skeletal, gripped my ankles, pulling me down with terrifying strength. In that moment, I knew the stories were true. The lake was haunted, and I was about to join the ranks of those who had never made it out. My vision blurred, and the world around me grew darker. But just as I felt consciousness slipping away, the hands released me. I shot up to the surface, gasping for air, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and terror. But the nightmare was far from over. As I swam back to shore, every stroke felt like a battle, as if the lake was trying to pull me back into its depth. When I finally reached the shallows, I collapsed onto the sand, my body shaking uncontrollably. I lay there, staring up at the sky, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But all I could think about were the hands, those cold, dead hands that had almost dragged me to my death. In the days that followed, the experience haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about the others, the ones who hadn't been so lucky, who had drowned in that cursed lake. Their faces appeared in my dreams, pale and lifeless, their eyes filled with the same terror I had felt. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a figment of my imagination. But the more I thought about it, the more real it became. I began to hear whispers in the night, faint and chilling, as if the spirits of the lake were calling to me. The sound of water dripping, even when there was none around, sent shivers down my spine. The hands that had pulled me under had left their mark, not just on my body, but on my mind. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The lake hadn't forgotten me. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt the mattress dip, as if someone had sat down beside me. My heart raced as I turned over, expecting to see nothing. But there they were, wet footprints leading from the door to my bed. I bolted upright, but the room was empty, silent except for the sound of my own breathing. The haunting presence of the lake had followed me home. In the days that followed, the manifestations grew stronger. Objects would move on their own, and the air around me would suddenly grow cold. as if a ghostly presence was near. I knew then that the lake had claimed a part of me, that I would never be free of it. The near drowning had been just the beginning, a chilling warning of what awaited those who dared to disturb the spirits of the deep. Even now, I can still feel the cold hands on my ankles, pulling me down into the darkness. The lake's curse is a heavy burden, one that I carry with me every day. And as much as I try to move on, I know that the spirits of the lake will never let me forget. They're waiting, watching, biding their time until they can claim what's theirs. It was supposed to be a routine drive home, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd taken that road 1,000 times before. That day, something was different. The sky was overcast, and a sense of unease settled over me as I drove through the winding hills. As I rounded a sharp bend, I saw her, standing on the side of the road, figure barely visible through the mist. She was waving as if she needed help, and without thinking, I pulled over. She was beautiful, in a haunting kind of way. Long, dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to look right through me. There was something about her that I couldn't quite put my finger on, something that drew me in. She told me her car had broken down and asked if I could give her a ride into town. Of course, I agreed. Who wouldn't? But from the moment she got into my car, I felt a chill in the air, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. As we drove, she didn't say much, just sat there quietly, staring out the window. I tried to make small talk, but her answers were brief, almost mechanical. There was an eerie stillness about her, as if she didn't quite belong in this world. The longer she was in the car, the more the temperature seemed to drop, and the more I felt an inexplicable fear gnawing at me. It wasn't until we reached the edge of town that she finally spoke again. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. She asked me to drop her off at a small, abandoned house on the outskirts. I hesitated, unsure if I should leave her there, but she insisted. As she got out of the car, she turned to me and smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine. "Thank you," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I won't forget that." I watched her walk up the path to the house, and just as she reached the door, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone, like a ghost fading into the mist. I sat there in shock, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. Before I could process it, my phone rang. Voice on the other end was frantic, telling me that a woman had died in a car accident on that very road a year ago, in the exact spot where I had picked her up. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The woman in my car had been a ghost, a spirit trapped in the world of the living, reliving the last moments of her life over and over again. But what haunted me the most was the way she had looked at me, the way she had thanked me, as if I had done something more than just give her a ride, as if I had somehow become part of her story, her fate. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The image of her face, the sound of her voice, lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a trick of the light. The memory was too vivid, too real. I found myself driving that road again and again, hoping to see her, find some closure, but she never appeared. Then, strange things started happening. Objects in my house would move on their own. Doors would open and close without explanation. And I would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as if someone was watching me. It was as if her spirit had followed me home, as if she had become attached to me in some way. The attraction I had felt towards her that night was turning into a fatal obsession. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold breeze brush against my face. I opened my eyes, and there she was, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes fixed on me with that same haunting smile. "You promised," she whispered, her voice sending chills down my spine. I tried to move, to scream, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. She reached out to touch me, and the moment her hand brushed my skin, everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone, the room silent and empty, but the sense of her presence lingered, a chilling reminder that I would never be free of her. The fatal attraction had sealed my fate, binding me to her forever. Now every time I drive that road, I feel her with me, a ghostly passenger that I can't escape. She's a part of me now, haunting presence that will never let me go. The climb had been treacherous from the start, the kind of hike that tests your limits and pushes you to the edge. But I loved the challenge, the thrill of reaching heights that few dared to conquer. That day, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a cool breeze. But as I neared the summit, something went terribly wrong. One misstep, a loose rock, and suddenly I was tumbling down the steep cliffside, the ground rushing up to meet me. I barely had time to register what was happening before I felt a sharp pain in my leg, followed by the sickening sensation of weightlessness as I plummeted towards certain death. But then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed me, strong, firm, pulling me back from the brink. I looked up, expecting to see my climbing partner, but instead I found myself staring into the eyes of a stranger. He was dressed in old-fashioned climbing gear, kind you'd see in black and white photos, and his face was a mask of calm determination. Without a word, he hauled me back onto solid ground, his grip never faltering. I tried to thank him, but the words caught in my throat. There was something eerie about him, something that quite makes sense. He gave me a reassuring nod before disappearing over the ridge, moving with an agility that belied his age. I called out to him, but he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. Shaken, I made my way back to the trail, my leg throbbing with pain. My partner found me a short while later, panic written all over his face. He had seen me fall, heard my screams, but when he reached the edge, I was already safe, lying on the ground with no sign of the stranger. I told him about the man who had saved me, but he looked at me like I was crazy. We were the only ones on the mountain that day, he insisted. No one else could have been there. As we made our way down, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. His calm presence, his old-fashioned gear, the way he had appeared out of nowhere, just in time to save my life. There was something haunting about it, something that didn't add up. When we reached the bottom, I asked around, trying to find out if anyone had seen him, but no one had. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began researching the mountain's history, hoping to find some explanation. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. Decades ago, a climber had died on that very spot, falling to his death in a freak accident. His name was Robert, and he was known for his bravery and skill as a mountaineer. But what really caught my attention was the description of his gear. It matched perfectly with what my rescuer had been wearing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The man who had saved me was Robert's ghost, still watching over the mountain where he had lost his life. It sounded absurd. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He had died trying to save a fellow climber, and now, even in death, he was still protecting those who ventured into the same perilous terrain. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that Robert was still out there, a silent guardian watching over the mountain. The thought was both comforting and chilling. Comforting because he had saved my life, and chilling because it meant that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than I had ever imagined. I began to notice strange things during my hikes. Cold spots, feeling of being watched, the occasional glimpse of a figure in the distance that would disappear when I got closer. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of the dangers that lurked on the mountain. But I also felt a strange connection to Robert, as if he was still guiding me, still there whenever I needed him. It was a haunting feeling, knowing that my life had been saved by someone who had already crossed over to the other side. Even now, when I climb that mountain, I can feel his presence, a ghostly shadow that follows me up the trail. And though I never saw him again, I know he's still there, watching, waiting, ready to step in if fate ever decides to test me again. The ghostly rescuer is a part of my life now, a chilling reminder that sometimes the past isn't as far away as we think. The plane crash was one of those tragedies that makes headlines for days. No survivors, debris scattered across a remote mountain range, a mystery that captivated the world. But for me, it was more than just a news story. I was supposed to be on that flight. Last-minute change of plans had saved my life, but the guilt of surviving weighed heavily on me. Chilling reminder of how fragile life can be. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped death. It haunted my dreams, filled my waking thoughts, and left me with an eerie sense of foreboding. Then the messages started. Cryptic, unsettling notes that appeared in my home, on my car, even in my inbox. They were simple but terrifying. It's not over. You were meant to be there. Can't escape fate. First, I tried to dismiss them as someone's sick idea of a joke. The messages kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. They were always signed the same way, with the initials of one of the passengers who had died in the crash. It was as if they were trying to communicate with me from beyond the grave, warning me that my time was running out. I became obsessed with finding out who was behind the messages. I traced the origin of the emails, checked the handwriting on the notes. But every lead ended in a dead end. The fear that had been gnawing at me since the crash began to consume my life. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except the haunting question. Why me? Why had I been spared? One night as I sat in my living room, the lights flickered and a cold breeze swept through the room. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of impending doom. Then I heard it. Faint, ghostly whisper that sent chills down my spine. You were supposed to die. The voice was barely audible, but it was there, clear as day, echoing through the silence. My heart raced as I looked around, but the room was empty. Only sound the pounding of my own pulse. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of the stress I had been under. But deep down, I knew it was real. The dead were trying to reach me, to warn me that my time was running out. And then I received the final message, the one that changed everything. It was a simple piece of paper, slipped under my door in the dead of night. Your fate is sealed, read, but you can still save others. It was accompanied by a date and a flight number. Flight that was scheduled to depart the next day, the same airline, the same route as the one that had crashed. My blood ran cold as I realized what it meant. Another crash was going to happen, and this time I had the chance to stop it. I knew I couldn't ignore the warning, no matter how insane it sounded. I contacted the airline, the authorities, anyone who would listen, but they all dismissed me as a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Time was running out, and I was the only one who could do something about it. Desperation fueled my actions as I made my way to the airport, determined to stop the flight from taking off. When I arrived, the scene was chaotic. Passengers boarding, airport staff rushing around, oblivious to the danger. I tried to warn them to stop the boarding process, but no one would listen. It wasn't until I shouted about a bomb on the plane that they finally took me seriously. The terminal was evacuated, and the flight was delayed. The passengers forced to disembark as security swept the plane. Hours later, after a thorough search, they found it. A mechanical failure that would have caused the plane to crash just minutes after takeoff. My warning had saved hundreds of lives, but it had come at a cost. I knew then that the messages had been real. The spirits of those who had died in the first crash had reached out to me, giving me a second chance to do what I couldn't before. Even now I can't explain how or why it happened, but I know that the final warning was a gift. Haunting reminder that fate is not always set in stone. The dead had spoken, and for once, someone had listened. The crash that never happened will forever be a part of my life. A chilling testament to the power of those who have passed on and the thin line between life and death. It started as a normal camping trip, a chance to escape the city and reconnect with nature. My friends and I had chosen a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any other camper. The first night was perfect. Clear skies, a warm fire, and the sound of laughter echoing through the trees. But by the second night, something changed. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that none of us could explain. We tried to brush it off, but as the night wore on, the feeling grew stronger. The firelight seemed dimmer, the shadows longer, and the woods around us felt eerily silent. It wasn't until we all went to bed that the true terror began. I woke in the middle of the night, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I sat up, peering into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. Figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the campsite. It was barely visible in the moonlight, its form almost blending into the shadows, but there was something chilling about the way it stood there, completely still, as if waiting for something. My heart raced, and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. When I finally managed to wake the others, the figure was gone. They laughed it off, saying it was just a trick of the light. Tough, but I knew what I had seen. The rest of the night passed in restless silence, and by morning, I felt completely drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. The others looked the same, pale, exhausted, and unnervingly quiet. We decided to pack up and leave early, but as we did, I noticed something strange. Plants around our campsite had withered, their leaves blackened and brittle, as if life itself had been sucked out of them. As we hiked back to the car, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. It was as if the forest was closing in on us. Trees leaning in, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. And then, one by one, my friends started to collapse. At first, we thought it was exhaustion, but it quickly became clear that something far more sinister was at play. Their skin grew pale, their breaths shallow, as if something was draining the life out of them. Panic set in as I tried to help, but there was nothing I could do. It was as if their very souls were being pulled from their bodies, leaving behind empty shells. The entity I had seen the night before was doing this. I was sure of it. It had followed us, latched onto us, and now it was taking what it wanted. By the time we reached the car, 2 of my friends were barely conscious, and I was struggling to stay upright. I could feel it too, the life slipping away from me, my strength fading with every step. But as soon as we left the woods, the feeling lifted, as if the entity couldn't cross the boundary. My friends slowly began to recover, but the experience had left its mark on us all. In the days that followed, we couldn't stop talking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. But the more we talked, the more we realized that none of us could remember the face of the entity. It was as if our minds had blocked it out, a defense mechanism against the horror we had witnessed. But one thing was clear. Whatever it was, it had taken something from us that we could never get back. The life-draining entity had left us forever changed, its presence haunting us long after we left the woods. I could still feel its cold touch, the way it had sucked the energy out of me, leaving me weak and vulnerable. And I knew that if I ever returned to those woods, it would be waiting, ready to finish what it had started. The thought was as chilling as it was terrifying, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. Even now, I avoid the woods, the memory of that night a constant, haunting presence in my mind. The life-draining entity may have let us go, but I know it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And this time, I won't be there to warn them. The day started off just like any other ice fishing trip. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the frozen lake stretched out like a vast white canvas beneath our feet. My buddy and I had been coming to this spot for years, always chasing that elusive big catch. We drilled our holes in the ice, set up our gear, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful day. But the silence that surrounded us wasn't the comforting kind. It was the eerie, almost haunting kind that makes your skin crawl for no reason at all. As the hours passed, a strange feeling started to creep over me. The ice beneath us seemed to groan and creak more than usual, as if it was straining under some unseen weight. I brushed it off, blaming my unease on the cold and the isolation. That didn't stop me from glancing nervously at the dark water peeking through the holes we'd drilled. It was then that I noticed something odd, a slight movement in the water, like something was stirring just beneath the surface. Before I could say anything, ice cracked. A sharp, chilling sound that echoed across the lake. My heart skipped a beat as I looked down to see a spiderweb of fractures spreading out from where we were sitting. We both jumped to our feet, panic setting in as the ice began to give way beneath us. The water was freezing, and as soon as I hit it, the cold shocked my system, stealing the breath from my lungs. I tried to grab onto the edge of the ice, but it kept breaking off in chunks, sending me deeper into the freezing water. My buddy was yelling, trying to reach me. The current was pulling me away, dragging me under. My limbs felt like lead. The more I struggled, the more the cold seeped into my bones, sapping my strength. The world around me blurred, eerie silence of the water drowning out my screams. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I felt something grab me, strong, firm hands pulling me up from the icy depth. I gasped for air as I broke the surface, coughing and sputtering as I was dragged onto solid ice. My buddy was there, his face pale with fear, but as I looked around, I realized there was no one else. The hands that had saved me had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. We stumbled back to shore, shivering and in shock, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had pulled me out of the water, something that wasn't quite human. As we sat in the truck, trying to warm up, it kept replaying the moment in my head. Image of those hands seared into my memory. They hadn't felt like normal hands. They were cold, almost lifeless. They'd saved me nonetheless. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was just my buddy who had saved me, that my mind had been playing tricks on me in the freezing water. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel those hands, could still see the dark shape beneath the ice that had been moving towards me. It was as if someone had been waiting under the ice, ready to claim another victim. I haven't been back to that lake since. The thought of what might be lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the ice to crack again, is enough to keep me away. The memory of that day is a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, and that sometimes, when the ice breaks, it's not just the cold that can claim you. Skiing had always been my escape, the one place where I could clear my mind and feel truly alive. That day, the mountain was perfect. Fresh powder, clear skies, and the rush of adrenaline as I carved my way down the slopes. But as I ventured farther off the beaten path into the backcountry, something about the landscape felt different. The usual thrill was replaced by a strange, eerie sense of foreboding, as if the mountain itself was watching, waiting for something to happen. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, skiing in the backcountry had its risks, but that was part of the allure. The solitude, the untouched snow, was worth the danger. But as I reached the top of a steep incline, I noticed the snow beneath my skis felt loose, almost unstable. I hesitated, looking around at the vast, silent expanse of white, and that's when I heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the mountain. My heart raced as the sound grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I had to move. Fast. Pushed off, speeding down the slope as the snow began to shift around me. The rumble turned into a roar. Before I could react, the avalanche was upon me. It was like being swallowed by the earth itself. A wall of snow crashing down, pulling me under, tumbling me head over heels in a blinding, suffocating whiteout. I fought to stay above the snow to keep my head up, but the force was too strong. The avalanche dragged me down, deeper and deeper, until I couldn't tell which way was up or down. Panic set in as the world around me became a blur of white, pressure of the snow crushing the air from my lungs. I was trapped, buried alive in a frozen grave, and I knew that if I didn't get out soon, I'd never see the light of day again. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard something. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. It cut through the roar of the avalanche, guiding me, urging me to move. With the last of my strength, I clawed at the snow, following the sound of the voice. My fingers were numb, my vision fading, but I kept digging, desperate to break free. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the avalanche stopped. I broke through to the surface, gasping for air, my body shaking with cold and exhaustion. The world around me was eerily silent. The snow settled in an eerie stillness that was both haunting and surreal. But what struck me the most was the realization that I was completely alone. There was no one around, No sign of the voice that had saved me. No footprints in the snow. Nothing. As I sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened, the weight of the experience began to settle in. I had come face to face with death on that mountain. And someone had pulled me back from the brink. The voice that had guided me out of the snow wasn't human. It was something else, something connected to the mountain, the countless souls who had perished in its unforgiving grasp. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was still with me. The voice was still out there, watching over those who dared to venture into its depth. I had narrowly escaped, but the memory of that day lingered, a chilling reminder of the power of nature, the thin line between life and death. The cries of those who hadn't made it still echoed in my mind, a haunting chorus that I knew I would never forget. Now, whenever I ski, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to hear that voice again. The avalanche had left its mark on me, a scar that runs deeper than any physical injury. It's a reminder that the mountain has its own rules, its own spirits, and that sometimes when you're buried under the snow, it's not just the cold you have to worry about. The ocean had always been my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of the waves and forget about everything else. That day, the beach was quiet, the sky overcast, and the water unusually calm. It was the perfect setting for a long swim, just me and the sea. I waded in, feeling the cool water rise around me, and started swimming parallel to the shore, letting the gentle current carry me along. But as I ventured farther out, the calmness became unsettling. The water was darker here, colder, and there was an eerie silence, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. I should have turned back, but something urged me on, deeper into the vast, open water. I swam for what felt like hours, the shore growing distant until a sudden, powerful current caught me off guard. It was like an invisible hand pulling me under, dragging me farther from the safety of the beach. Panic set in as I struggled against the current, but the more I fought, the stronger it became. My arms and legs felt heavy, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to stay afloat. The shore was now a distant memory, a faint line on the horizon that seemed impossibly far away. My strength was fading, and with it, the terrifying realization that I might not make it back. Just as I was about to go under, I felt a hand grab my arm, a strong, firm grip that pulled me up, holding me above the water. I gasped for air, my vision blurred by salt water and fear. I looked around, expecting to see another swimmer, a lifeguard maybe, but there was no one there. The hand that had saved me was gone, replaced by a strange cold current that seemed to guide me back towards the shore. I was too exhausted to question it, too desperate to survive. I let the current carry me, feeling the water push me along with an eerie, almost supernatural force. It was as if something, or someone, was pulling me to safety, determined to keep me alive. When I finally reached the shallows, I collapsed onto the sand, my body trembling with exhaustion and shock. The beach was as empty as I had left it, overcast sky casting a dull light over the deserted shoreline. As I lay there, catching my breath, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had been saved by a force I couldn't explain. Phantom presence that had pulled me from the brink of drowning. It was impossible, yet it had happened. And the more I thought about it, the more the memory took on a chilling, haunting quality. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. Someone, something, had been there with me in the water. In the days that followed, I scoured the news, asked around, trying to find any explanation, any report of a lifeguard or a nearby swimmer who might have seen me. But there was nothing. No one had been on the beach that day, and no one had seen what I had experienced. The hand that had pulled me from the water had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The ocean no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a place where the boundaries between life and death were thinner than I had ever realized. The memory of that day stayed with me, constant, chilling reminder of how close I had come to drowning, how something beyond my understanding had intervened. I still swim, but I never venture as far out as I used to. And I never swim alone. The phantom lifeguard is always in the back of my mind, a haunting presence that reminds me of the thin line between survival and the depths below. The night it happened, I was sound asleep in my bed, unaware of the danger creeping through the walls of my home. I'd always considered my house a sanctuary, a place where nothing bad could ever happen. But that night, something changed. I woke suddenly, my heart racing, though I wasn't sure why. The room was filled with a strange, eerie glow, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. It wasn't until I smelled the smoke that I realized the house was on fire. Panic surged through me as I jumped out of bed, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The flames were already licking at the doorframe, and the heat was intense, almost unbearable. I knew I had to get out. The smoke was thick, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. I stumbled through the room, trying to find my way to the door, but every direction seemed blocked by flames. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing, and I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Just when I thought there was no way out, I heard a voice. Calm, soothing voice that cut through the chaos. "This way," it said, clear as day, even though I couldn't see anyone. The voice guided me, leading me through the smoke and flames, directing me toward the window. I didn't question it. It just followed, desperate to escape the inferno that was consuming my home. I reached the window, my hands fumbling with the latch as the heat pressed in around me. The voice urged me on, telling me to climb out, to jump if I had to. With the last of my strength, I threw open the window and climbed out onto the roof. Cool night air, a stark contrast to the scorching heat inside. I scrambled down the side of the house, the voice still guiding me, until I was safely on the ground. Once outside, I turned to look back at the house, my heart still pounding in my chest. The flames had engulfed the entire building, and I could see that there was no way I would have made it out without the voice's guidance. But when I looked around, there was no one there. No neighbor, no passerby, no one who could have been the source of that voice. It was as if the voice had come from nowhere, from the very air itself. The fire department arrived soon after, but by then, the house was gone, reduced to smoldering ruins. They told me I was lucky to be alive, that I had made it out just in time. But I knew it wasn't luck. Something or someone had saved me that night, had guided me through the flames when I had been too panicked to think clearly. The memory of that voice was as chilling as it was comforting, a reminder that I had been saved by a force I couldn't explain. In the weeks that followed, I tried to find answers, but no one could tell me who or what had spoken to me that night. Voice had been so clear, so real, yet it had left no trace, no explanation. The experience left me with a haunting sense of awe and fear, as if I had glimpsed something beyond the ordinary, something that had intervened when I needed it most. I still think about that night, about the voice that saved my life. The memory of it lingers, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we can't explain, forces that can turn the tide in the most dire of situations. The burning house is gone, but the voice remains, echoing in my mind, a haunting presence that I'll never forget. Hiking had always been my way of clearing my head, of finding peace in the chaos of life. That day, the sky was a perfect blue, not a cloud in sight, and I felt the tension in my body ease as I made my way up the mountain trail. But as I reached the summit, something changed. The air grew thick, heavy with an unsettling stillness, and before I knew it, dark clouds began to roll in, fast and furious. Within minutes, the sky turned a deep, ominous gray, and I realized I was in the middle of a storm. The first bolt of lightning struck with a deafening crack, so close I could feel the electricity in the air. My heart raced as I looked around for shelter, but there was nothing, just the open mountainside, exposed and vulnerable. Panic set in as the wind picked up, whipping through the trees, and the rain started to pour in torrents. I knew I had to get down. The trail was slick, treacherous, and every step felt like it could be my last. As I stumbled down the trail, the storm grew more intense. The lightning was relentless, striking all around me, each bolt sending a chilling shockwave through my body. The thunder roared like an angry beast, drowning out all other sounds, and I felt completely alone, as if the world had been reduced to just me and the storm. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the sheets of rain, standing on the path ahead of me. At first, I thought it was another hiker, caught in the same terrifying situation. But as I got closer, I realized there was something different about this figure. It didn't move, didn't react to the storm raging around it. Instead, it seemed to glow with a faint, eerie light, almost as if it were part of the storm itself. My instincts told me to turn back, to run, but something kept me moving forward, drawn to the figure, despite the fear that gripped me. Just as I reached the figure, lightning struck again, so close I could feel the heat on my skin. I braced myself, expecting the worst, but instead of pain, I felt a strange, almost comforting warmth. The figure raised its hand, pointing to a small outcrop of rocks nearby, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I scrambled towards the rocks, sheltering under them, just as another bolt of lightning struck the spot where I had been standing seconds before. The storm raged on, but I felt a strange sense of calm, as if I was being protected by some unseen force. The figure was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, but the memory of it stayed with me, a haunting presence in the midst of the chaos. I waited out the storm, huddled under the rocks, my mind racing with what I had just experienced. When the storm finally passed, I emerged from my shelter, shaken but alive. The trail was littered with debris, the trees scarred from the lightning strikes, but I had made it through unscathed. As I made my way down the mountain, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the way it had appeared, just in time to save me, guiding me to safety. It was as if the storm itself had sent a protector, a guardian to ensure I made it out alive. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by the stress of the storm. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had been saved by something beyond this world, something that had appeared in the midst of the electrical storm to guide me to safety. The memory of that day is as chilling as it is comforting, a reminder that there are forces out there we can't explain, but that sometimes those forces are on our side. The day had started like any other. Routine commute on the train, familiar rumble of the tracks beneath my feet, and the comforting rhythm of the world passing by outside the window. I'd taken this route so many times that I could almost predict every twist and turn, every stop along the way. But today, something felt different. There was an uneasy tension in the air, a strange, chilling sense that something wasn't right. As the train sped along, I noticed the pace was faster than usual. The scenery outside blurred, and the usual stops came and went without the train slowing down. My fellow passengers began to exchange nervous glances, whispers, concern rippling through the carriage. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a temporary glitch, that the conductor would get things under control. But deep down, I knew this was more than just a minor malfunction. The train rocketed through another station without stopping, platform a flash of color as we hurtled past. People began to panic, some shouting, others frantically searching for the emergency brake. When someone finally pulled it, nothing happened. The train didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed to pick up speed, the wheels screeching against the tracks in a deafening wail. Realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were on a runaway train, and there was no way to stop it. Fear gripped the carriage as we raced towards a bend in the tracks, kind that would normally require the train to slow down. I could feel the tension in the air, the impending disaster that loomed just ahead. My heart pounded in my chest, and I braced myself for the worst, the image of the train derailing playing over and over in my mind. But just as we reached the curve, something happened, a sudden, eerie shift in the atmosphere. It was as if time slowed down, the world around me becoming strangely quiet, almost serene. I could still hear the train's wheels screeching, but it was distant, muffled, as though it was happening in another world. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. No, someone. standing at the edge of the track. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his figure illuminated by the flickering lights of the train. He didn't move, didn't react to the speeding train bearing down on him. He just stood there, calm and still, as if he belonged to the tracks. In that moment, something changed. The train seemed to lurch, as if it was being pulled back from the brink, the speed suddenly dropping as we rounded the bend. The screeching of the wheels quieted, and the train finally began to slow down, the impending crash averted by what felt like sheer force of will. The man by the tracks remained motionless, watching as the train passed, his figure fading into the darkness as we continued on. The train finally came to a stop at the next station, the doors opening to reveal a platform filled with anxious faces. He stumbled out, shaken but alive, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The conductor apologized profusely, explaining that the train's brakes had failed, that we were lucky to have made it out unscathed. But I knew better. It wasn't just luck that had saved us. It was the man by the tracks, the figure who had appeared out of nowhere to stop the train. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he had stood there, calm and composed, as if he had known exactly what was going to happen. I asked around, trying to find out if anyone else had seen him, but no one had. It was as if he had been a ghost, a guardian of the tracks, sent to protect us in our hour of need. The memory of that day is as haunting as it is surreal, a reminder that sometimes in the face of disaster, there are forces at work that we can't begin to understand. It was supposed to be a simple night out, a dinner at a nice restaurant, good food, and even better company. We'd been laughing and chatting, enjoying the atmosphere, when it happened. One moment I was taking a bite of my steak, the next I was gasping for air, my throat suddenly constricted. A piece of food was lodged tight, blocking my airway, and panic set in almost immediately. Couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, just the rising terror of suffocation taking over. The people around me reacted quickly, realizing what was happening. My friend leaped up, trying to perform the Heimlich maneuver, but it wasn't working. The room spun, dark spots clouding my vision, and I could feel myself slipping away, the air in my lungs growing thinner by the second. It was a moment of pure, chilling terror, kind you can't fully comprehend until you're in it. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I felt a sharp, sudden force in my chest. My friend had tried the Heimlich again, but this time, something was different. The food dislodged, flying out of my mouth, and I collapsed into my chair, gasping for air, my heart racing. Relief washed over me as I realized I could breathe again, the world coming back into focus. But the sense of relief was short-lived. Something about the experience left a strange, unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. I looked around, dazed, trying to piece together what had just happened. My friend was as shaken as I was, insisting they had felt something push against my back, something that wasn't just the force of their hands. It was as if an invisible presence had intervened, delivering the final blow, saved my life. The thought sent a chill down my spine, a haunting realization that I couldn't quite shake. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. It seemed like a straightforward case of choking, a near-death experience that had ended with me being saved. But there was something about the way the food had dislodged, force that had expelled it, didn't add up. It wasn't just the Heimlich maneuver that had done it. There was something else at play, something unseen but undeniably real. Then, a few days later, I found out something that made the whole experience even more unsettling. The steak I had choked on had been a special cut, aged and prepared in a traditional way. But what I hadn't known was that it had come from a restaurant that had a dark history. A place where, years ago, a man had died, choking on a similar piece of meat. The story was well known among the locals, a tale of bad luck and a cursed dish that had claimed a life. The realization hit me hard. Choking hazard had almost claimed another victim, me. But the force that had saved me, that had pushed the food from my throat, felt less like a stroke of luck and more like an act of intervention. It was as if the spirit of that man who had died years ago had stepped in to prevent the same fate from befalling someone else. The thought was chilling, a haunting reminder that some places carry the weight of their past, and sometimes the dead aren't as far away as we think. Now, whenever I dine out, I'm reminded of that night, the force that saved my life. It's a memory that lingers, a constant reminder that the line between life and death is thinner than we realize. The choking hazard wasn't just a freak accident. It was a brush with something beyond this world, something that left me forever changed. Rock climbing had always been my passion, a way to challenge myself and push my limits. The thrill of reaching new heights, of conquering the sheer face of a cliff, was unmatched. That day, the weather was perfect, and I felt confident as I began my ascent. The rock beneath my hands was solid, the sky clear, and everything seemed to be in my favor. But as I climbed higher, an unsettling feeling started to creep over me, a chilling sense that something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my movements, on finding the next handhold. The feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The cliff was unusually quiet, the usual sounds of nature eerily absent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't help but glance down, the drop below sending a wave of vertigo through me. I was almost at the top, just a few more feet to go when it happened. My hand slipped. The rock crumbled beneath my grip, and I lost my footing, my body lurching into the empty air. Time seemed to slow as I plummeted, the ground rushing up to meet me. Panic surged through me, and I instinctively reached out, desperate to grab hold of something, anything, to stop my fall. But there was nothing. Just the terrifying, gut-wrenching sensation of free fall. And then, just as suddenly as I had started to fall, I stopped. My descent was halted by something, or someone, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. My body jerked to a stop, and I looked up in disbelief. There was no one there, just my hand suspended in midair, held by an unseen force. The shock of it sent chills down my spine, and I felt a cold, eerie presence around me, as if I wasn't alone on that cliff. The force held me there, suspended over the abyss, for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, just hung there, frozen in place. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the force released me. I fell the last few feet, landing hard on a narrow ledge just below where I had been climbing. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to find a secure position, my heart racing with the realization of what had just happened. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it all. The rational part of my mind told me it was impossible, that there was no way I could have been saved by something invisible, something that defied explanation. But the memory of that iron grip, the cold presence that had stopped my fall, was too vivid, too real to dismiss. It was as if the cliff itself had reached out to save me, refusing to let me plummet to my death. When I finally gathered the courage to continue, I made my way to the top, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The experience had left me shaken, my confidence shattered, but I knew I had to finish the climb. As I reached the summit, I couldn't help but look back down at the spot where I had fallen, the ledge where I had landed. Felt like a distant memory, a surreal, haunting moment that would stay with me forever. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened on that cliff. I spoke to other climbers, hoping for some kind of explanation, but no one had ever experienced anything like it. The incident became a story, a legend among the climbing community. But to me, it was more than just a tale to tell. It was a chilling reminder of the forces that exist beyond our understanding, forces that can intervene when we least expect it. The cliffhanger, as I came to call it, left a mark on me that I carry to this day. I still climb, but I do so with a newfound respect for the power of the mountains, for the unseen forces that can shape our fate. The experience taught me that sometimes, when you're hanging by a thread, there's more than just luck keeping you from falling. It's something far more mysterious, something that lingers in the shadows, watching over us in ways we may never fully understand. The sea had always called to me, its vast, untamed waters a place where I felt truly free. That day, the weather was perfect for sailing. A gentle breeze, clear skies, and the horizon stretching out endlessly before me. I set out alone, my small sailboat cutting through the waves with ease. But as the day wore on, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, turning the once calm sea into a churning, restless beast. I tried to steer my boat back to shore, but the wind was too strong, the waves too high. The storm came on fast, and before I knew it, I was caught in the middle of it, the sky darkening as the waves towered over me. My boat was tossed around like a toy, and I struggled to keep it afloat, the salt spray stinging my eyes. The storm was relentless, and I knew I was in serious trouble. That's when I saw it, a ship, emerging from the fog like a ghostly apparition. It was an old ship, the kind you'd see in history books, with tall masts and tattered sails flapping in the wind. The sight of it sent chills down my spine, a strange, eerie feeling washing over me as I watched it approach. There was something off about it, something that didn't belong in this time. The ship cut through the waves with an unnatural grace, heading straight for me, and I felt a mix of fear and awe as it drew closer. My boat was on the verge of capsizing, and I knew I had to abandon it if I wanted to survive. The ghostly ship loomed over me, its hull casting a shadow over my small vessel. Just as my boat was about to be swallowed by the waves, a rope was thrown over the side of the ship, landing near me. Without thinking, I grabbed hold, clinging to it for dear life as I was pulled up onto the deck. The wind howled around me, the sea raging below, but on the deck of the ship, there was an eerie calm. I expected to be greeted by the crew, but the deck was empty, devoid of any life. The ship was silent, save for the creaking of the wood and the flapping of the sails. My heart raced as I looked around, searching for any sign of who had thrown the rope. There was no one, just the empty deck and the ghostly silence that surrounded me. It was as if the ship was moving on its own, guided by some unseen force. The storm raged on around us, but the ship sailed smoothly through the waves, untouched by the chaos of the sea. I felt a strange, chilling presence, as if the ship itself was alive, watching me with unseen eyes. I tried to find the helm, to steer the ship back to shore, but every turn led me deeper into the fog, the world around me fading into a gray void. The ship seemed to have a mind of its own, and I was just a passenger, caught in its ghostly wake. As the hours passed, I began to lose track of time. Fog thickened, wrapping the ship in a blanket of mist, and the world outside seemed to disappear. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the ship's timbers. I wandered the deck, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No crew, no passengers, just the empty, haunting vessel. The sense of unease grew with each passing moment, the realization that I was completely alone sinking in. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fog started to lift. The sky brightened, and the sea calmed, the storm passing as quickly as it had come. I rushed to the side of the ship, hoping to see land, but what I saw instead sent a chill through my bones. The ship was anchored just off the coast of a small island, its shores lined with ancient, crumbling tombstones. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the water around the ship was eerily still. My heart pounded as I realized where I was, the infamous graveyard of the Atlantic, a place where countless ships had met their end, their wrecks littering the seabed. The stories of ghost ships, of vessels lost to time, came flooding back to me, and I knew then that I was standing on one of them. The ship that had saved me was one of the lost, a relic of the past, its crew long gone, but its spirit still roaming the seas. Before I could fully process what was happening, the ship began to move again, turning away from the island and heading back out to sea. I felt a strange pull, as if the ship was urging me to stay, to join it on its eternal voyage. But something inside me fought back, a desperate need to escape the ghostly vessel before it was too late. I ran to the side, diving into the water just as the ship sailed away, disappearing into the fog once more. I swam to shore, gasping for air as I pulled myself onto the beach. The island was deserted, the tombstones standing silent and cold in the early morning light. I looked out to sea, but the ship was gone, leaving no trace of its passage. I was alone, stranded on the ghostly island, but I was alive. The ghost ship had saved me, but at what cost? The memory of that eerie, haunted vessel will stay with me forever. Chilling reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The desert was a place of extremes. Blistering heat by day, bone-chilling cold by night, and an endless expanse of sand that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I had always been drawn to its harsh beauty, the challenge of surviving in a landscape that seemed intent on pushing you to your limits. That day, I was alone, trekking across the dunes with nothing but my compass and my wits to guide me. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the horizon wavered in the distance, the heat distorting everything into a shimmering mirage. I had been walking for hours, my water supply running low, when I began to realize just how alone I was. The desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, and the isolation was overwhelming. The heat was oppressive, making it hard to think clearly, and the wind had picked up, blowing sand into my face, stinging my eyes. My footsteps felt heavy, each one harder than the last, as if the desert itself was trying to pull me down into its depths. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. I could feel the sweat evaporating off my skin almost as soon as it formed. My mouth was dry, my throat parched. The landscape around me began to blur, the dunes melting into one another, and I started to see things that weren't there. Shadows moving in the distance, shapes that vanished as soon as I focused on them. I knew I had to find shelter, but there was nothing, just miles and miles of empty sand. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it. A shimmering oasis on the horizon, lush and green, with water glistening in the sunlight. My heart leaped at the sight, hope surging through me as I quickened my pace. It had to be real. It was too vivid, too clear to be just a mirage. I stumbled towards it, my vision narrowing to that one point of salvation, the only thing that mattered in that moment. But as I drew closer, the oasis seemed to shift, the edges blurring and fading, until it was gone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It had been a mirage after all. Cruel trick of the desert. Despair washed over me, and I sank to my knees, the weight of exhaustion and dehydration pressing down on me. The sun beat down relentlessly, and I could feel my strength ebbing away, my vision darkening at the edges. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic voice calling my name, carried on the wind. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the shifting sands, unmistakable. I looked up, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure cloaked in white. The figure seemed to glow, an eerie light surrounding them, and their face was hidden by the hood of their cloak. They reached out a hand to me, beckoning me to follow, and in my desperation, I did. The figure led me across the dunes, their movements smooth and graceful, as if they were floating above the sand. I stumbled after them, too weak to question what was happening, too desperate to care. The voice kept calling to me, soothing, reassuring, guiding me through the harsh landscape. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, as if I was being protected, watched over by something otherworldly. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of a small canyon, and there, at the bottom, was a pool of water. It was small, but it was real. Cool, clear water that sparkled in the shadow of the rocks. The figure pointed to the pool, and I didn't hesitate. I scrambled down the rocks, falling to my knees beside the water, drinking deeply. Relief instant and overwhelming. When I looked up to thank the figure, they were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. I spent the night by the pool, recovering my strength, the memory of the figure haunting my thoughts. Who or what had saved me? The desert was known for its illusions, its tricks on the mind. This had been different. The figure had been real as the water I had drunk, as real as the canyon that had sheltered me. And yet, they had disappeared without a trace, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next morning, I found my way back to civilization, the desert fading into the distance behind me. The memory of that day stayed with me, a chilling reminder of how close I had come to death, and how something or someone had intervened. The desert mirage had almost claimed me. The figure had saved me, pulling me back from the brink. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there, but I know that the desert holds secrets, and that sometimes those secrets reach out to us when we need them most. The car accident was the kind of thing that happens in a blink of an eye. Patch of ice, skid, and then the world turning upside down. I remember the sound of metal crunching. Impact knocked the wind out of me, and then nothing. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. The room dimly lit, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. My body ached all over, and my head throbbed with pain. But what struck me most was the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. The hospital was old, the walls yellowed with age, the kind of place that felt more like a relic than a functioning facility. There were no doctors or nurses in sight, just the quiet hum of machinery and the occasional distant sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. As I lay there, trying to piece together what had happened, a strange, chilling feeling began to creep over me, a sense that I wasn't alone in the room. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my side, forcing me back down. That's when I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room, darker than they should have been, almost as if they were moving. My heart began to race, and I strained to see if someone was there, but the shadows just flickered and shifted, refusing to take shape. The fear that gripped me was unlike anything I'd ever felt before, cold, paralyzing, and all-consuming. Suddenly, the door to my room creaked open, and I froze, expecting to see a doctor or nurse. But the figure that entered wasn't dressed in hospital scrubs. It was a man, his clothes old-fashioned, his face pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Instead, he walked slowly to the end of my bed, staring out the window as if lost in thought. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, but my voice caught in my throat. The man turned to look at me then, his eyes hollow and empty, and a wave of cold swept over the room. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door ajar behind him. My mind raced with questions, but before I could make sense of what had just happened, the door creaked open again, and this time, a nurse entered. She was young, her expression kind but tired, and she seemed oblivious to what I had just witnessed. I asked her about the man, described him as best as I could, but she just looked at me with a puzzled expression. "There's no one like that working here," she said, her voice tinged with concern. The days that followed were a blur of painkillers and confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, its hollow eyes staring into mine. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, and I began to hear whispers in the night, faint, indistinct voices that made my skin crawl. The nurses assured me it was just the medication, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I knew better. There was something wrong with this place, something deeply unsettling. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could hear voices, multiple voices, speaking in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat up, the room cold and dark, and saw them. Figures standing in the corners of the room, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes fixed on me. They were patients, or at least they had been. I could tell by the hospital gowns they wore, the bandages that covered their wounds. Fear gripped me as I realized what they were, spirits, trapped in this place, unable to move on. They were the souls of those who had died here, lingering in the shadows, waiting for something, someone to acknowledge their existence. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the cold dread that filled the room. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, leaving me alone in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that I had to leave, that this hospital was not a place for the living. The next morning, I demanded to be discharged, ignoring the protests of the doctors and nurses. I didn't care about the pain or the injuries. I just needed to get out. As I left the hospital, I glanced back at the building, its windows dark and foreboding. The man I had seen on that first night stood in one of them, watching me with those hollow eyes. I turned away, my skin crawling with the knowledge that I had been in the presence of something beyond this world. The haunted hospital is a memory I'll never forget. A chilling reminder that some places are marked by the past, and that the spirits of the dead don't always rest in peace. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night out with friends, toasting to good times and future plans. The bar was packed, music loud, and the atmosphere electric. We ordered drinks, laughing and joking as the night unfolded, unaware that it would take a dark turn. I remember lifting my glass, cool rim pressing against my lips, and the sharp tang of alcohol as I took a sip. It tasted normal at first, just like any other drink. But within moments, a strange sensation began to spread through my body. My vision blurred, the sounds around me becoming distant and distorted, like I was slipping underwater. Panic set in as I realized something was terribly wrong. I tried to speak, call out to my friends, but my voice was a weak croak, lost in the noise of the bar. The room spun, and my legs gave out beneath me, sending me crashing to the floor. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, and I knew I had been poisoned. As I lay there, the world fading in and out of focus, I could feel the life draining from my body, poison working its way through my veins. My friends crowded around me, their faces a blur of concern and fear, but they seemed so far away, unreachable. The lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the bartender's face, twisted into a cruel smile. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body weak and trembling, hooked up to machines that beeped softly in the background. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that they had managed to flush the poison from my system just in time. But as they spoke, a strange feeling crept over me. Something was different. The world around me seemed sharper, more vivid, and there was an odd sensation in the back of my mind, like a presence I couldn't quite place. It wasn't long before I started seeing things. Flashes of memories that weren't mine, glimpses of places I'd never been. At first, I thought it was just the after effects of the poison, my mind playing tricks on me. The visions became more frequent, more intense. I would be walking down the street and suddenly find myself in a dark alley, or in a room filled with strange, unfamiliar faces. The sensations were so real, so vivid, that I couldn't tell if they were hallucinations or something more. Then, the voices started. Whispered conversations, faint and indistinct, echoing in my mind. They weren't my thoughts, the thoughts of someone else. Someone who had been close to death, just like I had. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was seeing the world through the eyes of the person who had poisoned me. Somehow, their life, their memories, had merged with mine in that moment when I had been on the brink of death. The more I tried to push the visions away, the stronger they became. I could feel their emotions, their fears, their desires, all swirling inside my mind. It was like I was living two lives at once, my own and theirs. With each passing day, the line between the two blurred further, leaving me wondering which thoughts were mine and which belonged to them. The connection was terrifying, and I knew I had to find out who had done this to me, who had tried to take my life, and, in doing so, had tied theirs to mine. I began to investigate, tracing the memories back to their source. It was a dark path, leading me to places I never would have gone, to people I never would have met. The person who had poisoned me was no stranger. They had been watching me, studying me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, through some twisted fate, I was seeing the world through their eyes, sharing their thoughts, their secret. The closer I got to the truth, the more the visions consumed me. I could feel the poisoner's mind pressing against mine, their memories bleeding into my own. It was like a haunting, but instead of a ghost, I was being haunted by the living, by the person who had tried to kill me. The connection was growing stronger, more invasive, till I could no longer tell where they ended and I began. In the end, I found them. The person who had poisoned me, the one whose mind had merged with mine. But confronting them didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. Instead, it only deepened the connection, solidifying the bond between us. Poison had done more than just threaten my life. It had fused our souls together, leaving us forever linked by that one deadly moment. Now, even though the poison is long gone, I still carry their thoughts, their memories with me. It's a chilling reminder that some bonds, once formed, can never be broken. The poison drink wasn't just an attempt on my life. It was the start of a haunting that I'll never escape. I've always been a collector, drawn to the strange and unusual. So when I stumbled upon the old, dusty shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, I couldn't resist exploring. The place was filled with curiosities from every corner of the world. Ancient relics, odd trinkets, and mysterious objects that seemed to hum with untold stories. But there was one item that caught my eye more than any other. A small, ornate box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. It sat alone on a shelf, almost as if it had been waiting for me. The shopkeeper seemed hesitant when I asked about it, his expression darkening as he warned me that the box was no ordinary artifact. He claimed it was cursed. Every owner had met with an untimely death. Of course, I didn't believe him. Who would? Curses were just superstitions, stories made to scare the gullible. I brushed off his warnings and bought the box, eager to add it to my collection. But from the moment I took it home, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small, almost insignificant. Cold draft in a room with no windows, flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the eerie sensations grew stronger, more insistent, and the atmosphere in my house became thick with unease. The box, once a fascinating relic, now filled me with a sense of dread every time I looked at it. One night, as I was examining the box more closely, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A hidden latch on the underside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully pried it open, revealing a small compartment inside. Nestled within was a rolled-up piece of parchment, yellowed with age. My heart raced as I unrolled it, revealing a series of strange symbols and words in a language I couldn't decipher. But the moment I touched the parchment, a wave of cold swept over me, and the lights in the room flickered. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting as if they were alive. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The sense of being watched intensified, and I felt a presence in the room with me. Something malevolent, something ancient. I tried to put the parchment back to close the box, but it was too late. The curse had been unleashed, and there was no going back. Over the next few days, my life began to unravel. The strange occurrences escalated, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut with no one near them, whispers in the dead of night. I could feel the presence growing stronger, feeding off my fear, and I knew it was connected to the box. Desperation set in as I tried to rid myself of the cursed artifact. No matter what I did, it always found its way back to me. I sought help, turning to experts in the occult, but they all told me the same thing. The curse was bound to me now, and the only way to break it was to pass the box on to someone else. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. How could I condemn someone else to the same fate? The thought of the box finding a new victim was too chilling to bear, so I kept it, hoping to find another way to end the curse. The haunting grew more intense with each passing day. I began to see figures in the shadows, ghostly apparitions that followed me wherever I went. My dreams were filled with nightmarish visions, scenes of death and destruction, all tied to the cursed box. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating me until I could hardly breathe. I knew I was running out of time. The curse would soon claim me if I didn't find a way to stop it. In a last desperate attempt, I decided to return the box to where it had come from, hoping that by retracing its steps, I could break the curse. I traveled to the remote village where the box had been discovered, deep in the mountains, far from civilization. The journey was long and treacherous, but I finally reached the place, a crumbling temple that had been abandoned for centuries. With trembling hands, I placed the box on the altar, hoping that the curse would end. But as I turned to leave, the ground beneath me shook, and the temple began to collapse. I ran, but the walls crumbled around me, trapping me inside. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the box, sitting on the altar, untouched by the destruction around it. The cursed artifact had taken another life, and its malevolent spirit would continue to haunt whoever dared to possess it next. The mansion had stood on the outskirts of town for as long as anyone could remember, its dark, looming silhouette a fixture against the skyline. Locals whispered stories about the place, tales of strange noises, unexplained lights, and the occasional glimpse of shadowy figures moving behind the windows. Most people avoided it, but not me. I've always been drawn to the mysterious, unknown, so when I had the chance to explore the mansion, I jumped at it. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different, thick and oppressive, as if the walls were holding on to years of secret. The grand foyer, once likely the pride of the house, was now a decaying shell of its former self, with peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. But what struck me most was the silence. It was so complete, so total, that even my footsteps seemed swallowed up by the darkness. I made my way through the mansion, each room revealing more signs of abandonment and decay. The further I ventured, the stronger the sense of unease became. The shadows seemed to move just out of sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Still, I pressed on, driven by a strange compulsion to see everything the mansion had to offer. That's when I found the staircase, a grand, sweeping structure that led to the upper floors, where the real secrets of the mansion lay. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, the sound echoing through the empty halls. At the top, I found a long, narrow corridor lined with doors, each one leading to a different room. I chose the first door on the left and pushed it open, revealing what appeared to be a bedroom. The room was dark, curtains drawn tight, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, but when I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only an empty corner and the eerie silence. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the sense of dread was undeniable. I moved to the next room, and then the next, each one revealing more of the mansion's dark past. Dusty furniture, old photographs, and the lingering feeling that something terrible had happened here. It wasn't until I reached the last room at the end of the hall that I found it, the source of the haunting. The door was heavy, resisting as I pushed it open, and the air inside was colder than the rest of the house. The room was empty, save for an old, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. The glass was cracked, spiderwebbed with fractures, but I could still see my reflection, or at least I thought it was my reflection. As I approached the mirror, I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't following my movements. It stood still, watching me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I reached out to touch the glass, but before I could, the reflection moved on its own, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across its face. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the reflection stepped forward, pressing its hand against the other side of the glass. The room grew colder, temperature plummeting as the reflection began to move on its own, mimicking the gestures of someone who wasn't me. I tried to turn and run, but my feet were frozen to the spot, the terror holding me in place. The reflection's smile widened, its eyes dark and empty, as it reached out toward me, the glass between us warping and bending as if it was about to break. Just as I thought the mirror would shatter, I felt a force pull me back, away from the glass. I stumbled out of the room, the door slamming shut behind me with a deafening bang. The house was silent again, the oppressive atmosphere gone. The memory of that reflection, the thing that had been trapped in the mirror, remained seared in my mind. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, leaving the mansion behind, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When I finally made it outside, the sunlight felt warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold, dark interior of the mansion. But even as I stood in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the reflection in the mirror wasn't done with me yet. Haunted Mansion still stands, secrets hidden behind those dark windows, but I've never gone back. The memory of that day, and the reflection that wasn't mine, is enough to keep me away for good. Flying had always been routine for me, just another part of the job. I'd taken off and landed more times than I could count. Cockpit almost like a second home. That day, the weather was clear, and everything seemed normal as we climbed to cruising altitude. Plane hummed along smoothly, the passengers settled in for the long haul, and I was just beginning to relax when it happened. An anomaly, a sudden jolt that shook the plane with a force I'd never felt before. The controls in front of me flickered, instruments going haywire as the plane seemed to lurch in midair. My co-pilot and I exchanged a glance, both of us on high alert as we tried to regain control. But the plane wasn't responding, the nose dipping dangerously as we lost altitude. The passengers must have felt it too, because the intercom crackled to life, the sound of panicked voices. My heart raced as I scanned the instruments, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, out of nowhere, voice came through the headset, calm, authoritative, and completely unfamiliar. "Pull up. Now." The voice was so clear, so insistent, that I didn't hesitate. I yanked back on the yoke, plane groaning in protest as it fought against the pull of gravity. The nose slowly began to rise, the altitude leveling off as the controls started to respond again. I could feel the tension in the cockpit ease slightly, but that voice, whoever it belonged to, still ringing in my ears. I glanced at my co-pilot, who looked as confused as I was. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. He nodded, his eyes wide, but when we checked the radio, there was nothing. No indication of where the voice had come from. No transmission on any frequency we were monitoring. It was as if the voice had come out of thin air, just in time to save us from a nosedive that could have ended in disaster. As we continued the flight, the atmosphere in the cockpit was tense, both of us on edge as we monitored the controls. Everything seemed to be functioning normally again, but the memory of that voice lingered, a chilling reminder of how close we had come to catastrophe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had intervened, guiding us back from the brink, when all hope seemed lost. When we finally landed, the passengers disembarked, oblivious to the near miss they had just experienced. My co-pilot and I stayed behind, running through the flight logs, trying to find any explanation for what had happened. But there was nothing, no sign of a malfunction, no record of a distress call, and most unsettling of all, no trace of the voice that had saved us. It was as if it had never existed. Phantom transmission that had only been heard by us. The incident stayed with me long after that flight. I spoke to other pilots, asking if they had ever experienced anything similar, but no one had. It was as if the event was unique to us, a one-time anomaly that defied explanation. The more I thought about it, the more the mystery deepened. Who or what had spoken to us that day? And how had they known exactly what to do to save the plane? I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about flying, about the world around me. The voice had been so clear, so real, that I couldn't just dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. It had saved our lives, but it had also left me with a sense of unease, haunting feeling that there was more to the skies than I had ever realized. The airplane anomaly became a story I rarely told, a secret I kept to myself, because who would believe it? Now, every time I step into the cockpit, I can't help but think of that day. The voice that came from nowhere and saved us. It's a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, there are forces at play that we can't understand. Forces that can turn the tide in an instant. The skies may seem endless and empty, but after that day, I knew they were anything but. The rain had been relentless for days, the kind of downpour that turned roads into rivers and fields into lakes. Our town, nestled in a valley, was no stranger to heavy rain, but this storm was different. Water levels rose faster than anyone expected, and before long, the rivers overflowed, flooding the streets and turning the town into a sprawling, murky lake. I watched in disbelief as the water crept higher, swallowing houses and cars, until there was nothing left but rooftops peeking above the surface. I had lived in that town my entire life, and I had never seen anything like it. The floodwaters were swift and unforgiving, and soon people were trapped in their homes, clinging to whatever high ground they could find. Power went out, plunging everything into darkness, and the only sounds were the rush of water and the occasional cry for help. I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to do something, so I grabbed my kayak, the one I usually used for peaceful trips down the river, and set out into the flooded streets. Paddling through the submerged town was surreal. Familiar landmarks distorted by the floodwaters. Streets I had walked my whole life were now hidden beneath the dark, swirling currents. I made my way towards the center of town, where the water was deepest, hoping to find anyone in need of help. The rain still poured down, heavy and cold, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. As I navigated the flooded streets, I heard it. Faint cry, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. I paddled towards the sound, my heart racing, and that's when I saw her, Indigure, standing on the roof of a submerged car, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering in the cold. She looked terrified, her eyes wide with fear, and she was alone. I called out to her. She didn't respond, just stared at me with those big, frightened eyes. I paddled closer, the water swirling around the car, and reached out to her. "Come on," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm here to help." But she didn't move, didn't even blink. It was like she was frozen in place, too scared to react. I was about to climb out of the kayak and get her when something strange happened. The rain seemed to let up for just a moment, and in that brief pause, I saw it. A small, crumbling gravestone sticking out of the water, right next to the car. The sight of it sent chills down my spine. The gravestone was old, worn smooth by time, but I could just make out the name carved into it. And then it hit me. I knew that name. It was the name of a little girl who had drowned in the river years ago, swept away by the current during another storm. The realization struck me like a punch to the gut. The girl standing on the car wasn't real. She was a ghost, a spirit trapped by the floodwaters that had claimed her life. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The girl's expression didn't change, her eyes still locked on mine, but there was something in her gaze that was both sad and pleading. It was as if she was asking for help, for something that I couldn't give. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just leave her there, even if she wasn't real. So I reached out again, my hand trembling, and as soon as my fingers brushed her arm, she vanished. Kayak rocked as I lost my balance, and I nearly fell into the water, but I managed to steady myself. Girl was gone, the car still half submerged in the floodwaters, the gravestone barely visible in the dim light. I sat there, stunned, the rain pouring down again, harder than ever. The town was still flooded, the water still rising, but all I could think about was that little girl, a ghostly figure standing alone in the storm. I eventually made my way back, helping those I could find. The memory of that girl haunted me. I asked around, trying to learn more about her, but no one knew much, just that she had been swept away by the river, her body found days later. Floodwaters receded eventually, the town slowly returning to normal, but the image of that girl, standing on the car, stayed with me. The flooded town had taken its toll, but it had also brought something else to the surface, something that had been lost to time, forgotten by most. The girl's spirit had been trapped there, waiting for someone to see her, to acknowledge her. And now, even though the waters have long since drained away, I still think of her. A chilling reminder that some things never truly leave us, no matter how deep they're buried. The hiking trail was one I had taken countless times before. Familiar, well-worn, a place where I could escape the stress of daily life. It wound through dense forests, up steep hills, and along narrow ridges, offering breathtaking views of the valley below. That day, something felt different. The air was thick, heavy with humidity, and a strange stillness hung over the forest, as if the world was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to my imagination, and pressed on. As I reached a particularly steep section of the trail, ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting slightly with each step. The path had always been rocky, but this was different. There was a give to the earth that hadn't been there before. My heart skipped a beat, but I pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the climb. The trees around me were dense, their branches casting eerie shadows on the ground, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was nearly at the top of the ridge when it happened, a sudden, violent tremor that shook the ground beneath my feet. Before I could react, the earth gave way, the trail collapsing into a sinkhole that opened up like a mouth, swallowing me whole. I screamed as I fell, the world around me a blur of dirt and rocks, the light above quickly fading as I was sucked into the darkness below. The fall seemed to go on forever, but it was over in a second. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I just lay there, stunned, trying to process what had happened. The air was cool and damp, the smell of earth filling my nostrils. I could barely see anything in the dim light that filtered down from the hole above, but I could tell I was deep underground, trapped in a cavern that had no business being there. Panic set in as I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. The walls of the cavern were rough, jagged, and the ceiling loomed high above. A distant circle of light, the only sign of the world I had just left. I was alone, buried alive in a place that seemed both ancient and unnatural, as if the earth had opened up just to claim me. My hands shook as I tried to find a way out. The walls were too steep, too slick with moisture to climb. I called out for help, my voice echoing off the walls, but there was no answer, just the oppressive silence of the underground. The weight of the earth pressed down on me, the darkness closing in, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. I was trapped, swallowed by the earth, with no one to hear my cries. As the hours passed, the fear that had gripped me began to morph into something else, a strange, eerie calm. I sat down, my back against the rough stone, and tried to steady my breathing. That's when I noticed it. Faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves or the whisper of wind through the trees. There was no wind down here, no leaves, only the cold, dark earth. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from beneath me. I shifted, the ground beneath me feeling strange, almost alive. My breath caught in my throat as I looked down and saw them. Roots, thick and gnarled, snaking through the earth like veins. They moved slowly, almost lazily, but there was something unsettling about the way they twisted and turned, as if they were searching for something. I tried to scramble away, but the roots seemed to sense my movement, reaching out with unnatural speed. They wrapped around my legs, pulling me back down, holding me in place. I struggled, panic surging through me once more, but the roots were strong, unyielding. It was as if the earth itself had come alive, refusing to let me go. I could feel the cold, damp ground beneath me shift, the roots tightening their grip, and I knew I was losing the fight. In that moment, I thought of all the stories I'd heard about people disappearing in the mountains, never to be seen again. I had always dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, trapped in the belly of the earth, couldn't help but wonder if there was truth to them. The roots seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and I realized that they weren't just holding me, they were drawing me deeper into the earth, pulling me down into the dark, suffocating soil. Just as I was about to give in, something miraculous happened. The roots loosened their grip, almost as if they were letting me go. I didn't wait to question it. I scrambled to my feet and started to climb, using the roots themselves as handholds. Climb was grueling, my muscles burning with the effort, but I pushed on, the circle of light above growing larger with each passing moment. Finally, with one last burst of strength, I pulled myself out of the hole, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. I lay there for a long time, the sky above me a brilliant blue, sun warm on my face. The terror of the underground cavern still clung to me, but I was alive. The earth had swallowed me. Somehow, it had let me go. As I made my way back down the trail, my legs shaking with every step, I couldn't help but glance back at the spot where the ground had given way. It looked innocent enough now, just another patch of rocky soil, but I knew better. The earth had secrets, ancient and dark, and I had been lucky to escape them. Working on skyscrapers had always been a thrill for me. The rush of adrenaline as I balanced on steel beams high above the city, the wind whipping around me, the world far below. It was a dangerous job, but I loved it, and I prided myself on my skill and fearlessness. That day, we were putting the finishing touches on a new building, the final beams being hoisted into place. The The sky was clear, the air crisp, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. Until it wasn't. I was standing on a narrow beam, guiding a piece of steel into place, when something went wrong. The beam shifted unexpectedly, crane operator losing control for just a moment, but it was enough. I lost my balance, my feet slipping on the smooth steel, and suddenly I was falling, plummeting toward the ground far below. Time seemed to slow as I fell, the wind rushing past my ears, the ground rushing up to meet me. My heart raced, and all I could think about was the impact that was sure to come, the end of everything in a split second. But then, just as suddenly as I had started to fall, I felt something grab me, an unseen force that stopped my descent in midair. It was as if a giant hand had reached out and caught me, holding me suspended over the void. My body jerked to a halt, and I hung there, frozen in shock and disbelief. I looked around, expecting to see a safety line or a net that had somehow saved me, but there was nothing, just the open air around me and the steel beams of the skyscraper. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could I be hanging in midair with nothing to support me? It was impossible, yet there I was, suspended above the city, defying gravity itself. Before I could process it any further, force that held me began to lift me back up, slowly and steadily, as if I were being pulled by an invisible rope. I could feel the pressure around my chest, firm but gentle, guiding me back to the safety of the steel beam. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps as I was set down on the beam, my legs trembling beneath me. I was safe, but I couldn't explain how or why. I sat there for a long moment, trying to steady myself, the wind still whipping around me, the city still far below. My coworkers, who had seen me fall, were shouting, their faces pale with fear and confusion. They had no idea what had just happened, no explanation for how I had survived. I didn't either. All I knew was that some force had intervened, stopping me from falling to my death. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. I replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to find a rational explanation. There was none. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. It was as if the skyscraper itself had reached out to save me, refusing to let me fall. The experience left me shaken, my confidence in my own abilities rattled by the knowledge that I had been saved by something beyond my control. I spoke to others who had worked in construction for years, hoping to find someone who had experienced something similar, but no one had. The incident became a story, a strange tale told among the workers. But to me, it was more than just a story. It was a chilling reminder of how close I had come to death, and how something had pulled me back from the brink. Even now, when I'm high above the city, working on another skyscraper, I can't help but think about that day. The final swing, as I came to call it, is a memory that haunts me, a reminder that no matter how skilled or fearless we are, there are forces in this world that we can't understand, forces that can change the course of our lives in an instant. The skyscrapers may stand tall and strong, but I know now that there's more to them than meets the eye. Something watching, something waiting, ready to intervene when the final swing comes. The old office building had always had its quirks, flickering lights, creaky floors, and an elevator that seemed to have a mind of its own. I never thought much of it. After all, it was just part of the building's charm, or so I told myself. That day, I was in a rush, running late for a meeting on the top floor. Stairs weren't an option, so I hurried to the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly in my impatience. When the doors finally opened with a sluggish hiss, I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the cables echoing above me. The doors closed, and the elevator jolted as it began its ascent. I leaned against the wall, watching the numbers tick upwards, my mind already on the meeting ahead. But just as the elevator reached the halfway mark, it shuddered violently, the lights flickering before plunging the small space into darkness. My heart skipped a beat as the elevator groaned, a low, ominous sound that sent chills down my spine. Then, without warning, the elevator began to plummet. The sensation was immediate and terrifying. Free fall. My stomach lurched as the floor dropped out from under me. the walls rushing up around me as the elevator plunged downward. I grabbed onto the handrail, my knuckles white with fear, as the darkness swallowed me whole. The air was thick with the sound of metal screeching against metal, the cables straining as they fought to regain control. But the elevator kept falling, faster and faster, the ground rushing up to meet me. I braced myself for the impact, my heart pounding in my chest, every second dragging on like an eternity. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen when the elevator hit the bottom. Would I survive? Would it be quick? But just as suddenly as the descent had started, stop. The elevator jerked violently, and I was thrown against the wall as it came to an abrupt halt, the cables straining to hold it in place. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, didn't think. Just the overwhelming relief that I was still alive, that the elevator hadn't crashed to the ground below. The lights flickered back on, casting a dim, eerie glow over the small space. I looked up at the ceiling, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain what had just happened, but there was nothing. Just the dull hum of the elevator as it hung suspended in the shaft, the ground far below and the top floor still out of reach. My hands trembled as I pressed the emergency button, my voice shaky as I called for help. The intercom crackled to life, the building's security assuring me that they were aware of the malfunction and that help was on the way. But their words were distant, almost unreal, as I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Fear still gripped me, the memory of the plunge fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something beyond just a mechanical failure. As I waited for the rescue team, I couldn't help but notice the faint, almost imperceptible sound of whispering, as if the elevator itself was alive, murmuring secrets in the dark. I strained to listen, but the voices were too quiet, too distant to make out. The sound sent a chill down my spine, a haunting reminder that there was more to this old building than meets the eye. When the rescue team finally arrived, they pried open the doors, and I stumbled out, grateful to be back on solid ground. They checked the elevator, assuring me that it was safe, that the cables had held, and that I had been lucky to avoid a crash. But I knew better. The elevator hadn't just malfunctioned, it had fallen, and something had stopped it just in time. Whether it was luck, fate, or something more, couldn't say, but the experience left me shaken, haunted by the memory of the plunge. Even now, I avoid that elevator, taking the stairs whenever I can. The thought of stepping back inside, of hearing those cables creak and groan as the elevator ascends, is too much to bear. The plunge is a memory that lingers, chilling reminder of how close I came to disaster and how something or someone intervened to save me. The old office building may still stand, but I know now that it holds secrets, dark and eerie, waiting in the shadows. The forest had always been a place of mystery, a sprawling wilderness that seemed to stretch on forever. I'd heard stories about it my whole life, tales of strange creatures, hidden clearings, and ancient trees that whispered secrets to those who would listen. But I'd never really believed them, chalking them up to local folklore. That day, though, I decided to venture deeper into the forest than I ever had before, driven by curiosity and the promise of solitude. The path was narrow and overgrown, the trees towering overhead, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted as if shaped by some unseen force. Further I went, the more the world outside seemed to fade away, until it was just me and the forest. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing, a small circular space surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to watch over it like silent guardian. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, larger and older than any I'd ever seen. Its roots spread out across the ground like the fingers of a giant hand, and its branches reached high into the sky, disappearing into the canopy above. There was something about the tree that drew me in, a strange, eerie energy that pulsed in the air around it. I approached the tree, feeling a sense of awe and unease in equal measure. The bark was rough under my fingers, the wood cool to the touch despite the warmth of the day. As I circled the tree, I noticed something carved into the trunk. Symbols, ancient and worn, almost invisible against the dark bark. My heart raced as I traced the symbols with my fingers, feeling a strange tingling sensation that spread through my hand and up my arm. It was as if the tree was alive, aware of my presence. Suddenly, the air around me grew colder, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The birds fell silent, the rustling of the leaves ceased, and an eerie stillness settled over the clearing. I turned to leave. My feet wouldn't move, as if they were rooted to the ground. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped, held in place by some unseen force. The tree's branches swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel, and I could have sworn I heard a whisper. A soft, melodic voice carried on the wind. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from the tree itself. The symbols carved into the bark began to glow faintly, pulsing with a soft green light. My heart pounded in my chest as the voice spoke, the words incomprehensible but filled with a sense of urgency. It was as if the tree was trying to tell me something, to convey a message that I couldn't quite grasp. The light grew brighter, the voice more insistent, until I was overwhelmed by the sensation of being watched, being surrounded by something far greater than myself. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light faded, whispering ceased, and the forest returned to its normal state. Birds singing, the leaves rustling, and the air warm and inviting once more. I stumbled back, my heart still racing, the sense of unease lingering in the back of my mind. Clearing, once filled with an almost magical energy, now seemed ordinary. The ancient tree just a tree once more. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something had changed. The symbols on the tree's trunk were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. The sense of being watched, however, remained, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was aware of me, that it had allowed me to leave but would never truly let me go. The walk back through the forest was uneventful, but I couldn't escape the eerie sensation, followed me every step of the way. When I finally emerged from the trees, the sunlight was blinding, and the sounds of the outside world rushed back in a cacophony of noise and life. But the memory of the enchanted forest stayed with me, a haunting reminder of what I had experienced. I had ventured into a place that was more than just a collection of trees and paths. It was alive, aware, and filled with secrets that I could barely comprehend. The forest had let me go, but I knew that a part of me would always remain there, a small piece of my soul entwined with the ancient roots of the enchanted tree. It was one of those cold, misty nights where the fog rolled in thick, shrouding everything in an eerie, gray haze. I was driving along a lonely stretch of road, the kind that seemed to go on forever without a single sign of civilization. The headlights barely cut through the fog, and the trees lining the road loomed like shadowy figures, their branches reaching out like twisted arms. I was the only car on the road, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old suspension. That's when I saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the thick fog. He was hitchhiking, his thumb outstretched, his silhouette dark against the swirling mist. I wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about him compelled me to stop. Maybe it was the loneliness of the road, or the strange, almost magnetic pull I felt, but before I knew it, I was pulling over. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood. There was something unsettling about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I shook off the feeling and tried to make small talk. He didn't say much, just pointed straight ahead, as if indicating that I should keep driving. The silence between us grew heavy, the air in the car thick with an unspoken tension that made my skin crawl. As we drove, I couldn't help but steal glances at him out of the corner of my eye. His presence was unnerving, his silence even more so. There was a strange aura about him, something almost otherworldly, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The road stretched on, and the fog seemed to grow thicker, the world outside the car fading into a gray void. The longer we drove, the more the road seemed to twist and turn, leading us deeper into the unknown. After what felt like hours, the stranger finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and his words sent a chill down my spine. "Turn here," he said, pointing to a narrow, barely visible road that branched off into the fog. My instincts screamed at me to keep going, to stay on the main road, but something about his voice compelled me to obey. I turned the wheel, the tires crunching on the gravel as we left the paved road behind. The new road was rough, overgrown with weeds and lined with ancient trees that seemed to close in around us. The headlights struggled to penetrate the darkness, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The stranger sat silently beside me, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he knew exactly where we were going. Further we went, the more the unease grew, until I could barely breathe from the tension. Finally, the road ended in front of an old, decrepit house, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The stranger turned to me then, his eyes hidden in the shadow of his hood, and for the first time I felt real fear. "This is where I get off," he said, his voice like a cold wind that cut straight to my bones. I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he opened the door and stepped out into the fog. He disappeared into the mist almost immediately, his figure swallowed by the gray. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, before I finally forced myself to drive away. The road back seemed even longer, the fog thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The stranger was still with me somehow, even though the passenger seat was empty. When I finally made it back to the main road, the fog began to lift, and the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The events of the night felt like a bad dream, but the unease lingered, a gnawing sensation that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until I stopped for gas at a small roadside station that I learned the truth. The attendant, an old man with a weathered face, asked where I'd come from, and when I mentioned the old house, his expression darkened. He told me that the house had been abandoned for years, ever since the man who lived there, a recluse, had died under mysterious circumstances. No one had been there since, and the road leading to it all but disappeared. The man's story sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew then that the stranger I'd picked up was no ordinary hitchhiker. He was something else, something that had led me to that house for reasons I couldn't understand. The memory of that night stays with me, a haunting reminder of the stranger who vanished into the fog. I still drive that road sometimes, but I never pick up hitchhikers, and I never turn down unfamiliar roads. The vanishing stranger is a mystery I'll never solve, a chilling encounter that left me with more questions than answers. All I know is that some roads are better left untraveled, and some strangers are better left unseen. It was supposed to be a simple job, just another day of checking on an old property that had been sitting vacant for years. The house was one of those classic sprawling old homes that had seen better days, with peeling paint, cracked windows, and an overgrown yard that hinted at years of neglect. I'd been hired to inspect the place before it went on the market, to make sure everything was in order. It seemed straightforward enough, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air inside the house was stale, thick with the smell of damp and decay. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows darker than they should have been. I made my way through the rooms, checking for leaks, cracks, and any other signs of damage. It wasn't until I reached the basement door that I noticed it. Faint sound of water, a soft, persistent dripping that echoed through the house. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob. The basement was always the worst part of these jobs. Dark, cold, and usually full of surprises. But I had a job to do, so I took a deep breath and opened the door. The smell of damp earth hit me immediately, and the sound of dripping water grew louder as I descended the narrow, rickety stairs. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the small, grimy window near the ceiling. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized the source of the sound. The basement was flooded. Few inches of murky water covered the floor, reflecting the faint light from the window. I cursed under my breath, knowing this would mean more work, more time spent in this dark, musty place. But as I stepped forward, something else caught my attention. Faint, almost imperceptible ripple in the water, as if something had just moved beneath the surface. I froze, my heart racing. The air was thick with moisture, the walls slick with condensation, and the temperature seemed to drop the further I went. I took another step, the water lapping at my boots, and that's when I saw it. Figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing at the far end of the basement. It was a man, his clothes drenched, his head bowed, as if he were staring at the water around his feet. I called out to him, but he didn't respond, didn't even move. My heart pounded in my chest as I took another step closer, the water sloshing around me. The man remained still, his figure half submerged in the water. The closer I got, the more the unease grew, a deep, unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. I called out again, louder this time. Still, he didn't respond. It was as if he hadn't heard me at all. I was just a few feet away when I noticed it. The water around his feet wasn't just water. It was dark, thick, almost like tar, and it seemed to be pulling him down, inch by inch. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The man slowly lifted his head, and our eyes met. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were empty, void of any life. Chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't a living person. It was a spirit, a ghost trapped in the flooded basement, bound to the water that had claimed him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Just a low, guttural moan that sent a wave of cold dread through me. Before I could react, the water around him began to churn, the dark, thick substance pulling him down faster now. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the fear, the desperation in them, as if he were begging me to help him. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, paralyzed by the terror that gripped me. The water swallowed him whole, and within moments, he was gone, leaving nothing but ripples on the surface. I stumbled back, my heart racing, air around me thick with the weight of what I had just witnessed. The basement was silent again, the only sound the soft drip of water from the ceiling. I turned and ran, the stairs creaking under my weight as I fled the basement, the house, everything. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The memory of the man's empty eyes burned into my mind. I never went back to that house. I told my employer that the property was beyond repair, that it was best left alone. The memory of the flooded basement and the ghostly figure trapped within it still haunts me. It's a chilling reminder that some places are not just old or abandoned, they're cursed, holding on to the spirits of those who met a tragic end within their walls. And sometimes, those spirits are still waiting, bound to the water that claimed them, seeking release from their watery prison. It had been years since I last visited the old military base, now long abandoned and overrun by nature. The once bustling site, full of soldiers and equipment, was now a decaying relic forgotten by time. My friends and I had always talked about exploring it, especially the underground bunker that had been sealed off for decades. Rumor had it that the bunker was haunted, that strange things had happened there during the war. But we never believed the stories, until we decided to see it for ourselves. The day we chose to go was gray and overcast, kind of weather that matched the mood of the base perfectly. We made our way through the crumbling buildings, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As we approached the entrance to the bunker, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door was rusted and covered in vines, but it still stood, a silent guardian to whatever lay within. It took all our strength to pry the door open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. The air that rushed out was stale, cold, and smelled of earth and mold. We hesitated for a moment, exchanging nervous glances, but then we stepped inside. The bunker was dark, the only light coming from the narrow beams of our flashlights. The walls were lined with old equipment, long forgotten and covered in dust, and the floor was littered with debris. As we ventured deeper into the bunker, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Our breath fogged in the air, and the silence was almost deafening. The narrow corridors twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the underground labyrinth. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. The further we went, the stronger the sense of unease became, until it was almost unbearable. Then, we heard it. Faint, distant whisper, echoing through the corridors. It was so soft at first that we weren't sure if we'd actually heard it, but it grew louder, more distinct. The voice was low, guttural, and filled with an unmistakable sense of dread. It was speaking in a language we couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. Whatever it was saying, it wasn't welcoming. We stopped in our tracks, our flashlights flickering as the air around us grew colder, the whispers growing louder, closer. Panic set in as we realized we weren't alone in the bunker. Turned to leave. The path behind us seemed different. Corridors twisting in ways they hadn't before. It was as if the bunker itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap us inside. Whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were right behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I saw them, shadowy figures barely visible in the darkness, watching us with cold, empty eyes. We broke into a run, our footsteps echoing through the bunker as we desperately tried to find our way out. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading us deeper into the darkness. The whispers were all around us now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that filled the air with a sense of dread. My heart raced as we stumbled through the darkness, cold seeping into my bones, feeling of being watched, never leaving. Just when I thought we'd never find our way out, we rounded a corner and saw it. Entrance. The door still open, a sliver of gray light shining through. We sprinted towards it, the whispers reaching a fever pitch, the shadowy figures closing in around us. I could feel them right behind me, their presence heavy and suffocating, as if they were reaching out to pull us back into the darkness. But we made it, bursting out of the bunker and into the cold, damp air outside. We didn't stop running until we were far from the base, our hearts pounding, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were gone, shadowy figures left behind in the darkness of the bunker. The memory of what we had experienced stayed with us. The haunted bunker wasn't just a story, a legend passed down through the years. It was real, and it was alive, still echoing with the voices of those who had perished within its walls. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us out, but the bunker's dark presence isn't confined to its underground corridors. The memory of those whispers, those shadowy figures, haunts me, chilling reminder of the things that lurk in the places we've long forgotten. The bunker still stands, abandoned and silent, but I know better than to go back. Some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep where they belong. Surfing had always been my escape, a way to leave behind the noise of the world and find peace in the rhythm of the ocean. That day, the waves were perfect, tall, powerful, and rolling in with a steady cadence that made my heart race with excitement. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the water, and the beach was nearly empty, save for a few other surfers scattered along the shoreline. I paddled out, salt spray in my face, feeling the familiar rush of anticipation as I waited for the next big wave. It wasn't long before I spotted it, a massive wave building on the horizon, growing larger as it approached. My pulse quickened as I positioned myself, paddling with all my strength to catch it. The wave lifted me up, and for a moment I was riding high, the world dropping away beneath me as I soared along the crest. But then, something went wrong. The wave began to curl faster than I expected, and before I knew it, I was caught in the powerful pull of the water, tumbling out of control. I was thrown from my board, force of the wave slamming me into the water with a bone-jarring impact. The world became a blur of churning water, the surface lost in the chaos of bubbles and foam. My lungs screamed for air as I was dragged deeper, the weight of the water pressing down on me. Panic set in as I struggled to orient myself, to find which way was up, but the current was too strong, pulling me further into the depths. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, I saw something. Figure, barely visible through the murky water, moving towards me with a grace that seemed impossible in the chaos. At first, I thought it was another surfer, but as the figure drew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a man, but there was something off about him, something that sent chills down my spine even in the cold water. He reached out to me, his hand closing around my arm with a grip that was both firm and gentle. I was too desperate for air to resist, too weak to question what was happening. The man pulled me upwards, cutting through the water with ease, guiding me back towards the surface. My vision blurred as I gasped for breath, the world above growing brighter, the water losing its hold on me. We broke the surface together, cool air hitting my face like a blessing. I took in deep, shuddering breaths, coughing up water as I clung to the man who had saved me. But when I looked at him, my breath caught in my throat. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were dark, bottomless, like the depths of the ocean itself. There was something haunting about him, something otherworldly, made my heart race with fear. Before I could say anything, he let go of my arm and began to sink back into the water, his body disappearing beneath the waves as if he were part of the ocean itself. I watched in stunned silence as he vanished, the water closing over him without a ripple, as if he had never been there at all. The sea around me was calm once more, the waves gentle, as if the storm that had almost claimed me had passed. I paddled back to shore, my heart still pounding. The memory of the man's face burned into my mind. The other surfers hadn't noticed anything, too focused on their own rides to see what had happened. I dragged my board onto the sand, collapsing in exhaustion, the sun now a fiery orange on the horizon. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just encountered something, or someone, beyond this world, a guardian of the sea who had saved me from certain death. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened, but the memory of the crashing wave and the man who had saved me remained as clear as the day it occurred. I spoke to others, but no one could explain it. The ocean has always been a place of mystery, full of secrets and dangers, and I realized that I had glimpsed one of those secrets that day. The crashing wave had almost taken me. Something or someone had intervened. Now, every time I paddle out, I can't help but think of that man, of the dark, bottomless eyes that had looked into mine as he pulled me from the depths. The ocean is still my escape, my place of peace, but I know now that it's also a place of power, a place where forces beyond our understanding reside. The memory of that day stays with me, chilling reminder of how close I came to never returning to shore. The old train tracks near the edge of town had long been abandoned, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by most. They hadn't seen a train in decades, and the stories about them were just that, story. Or so I thought. The tracks cut through a dense stretch of woods, a place where the trees grew thick and the shadows were deep. People said that those woods were haunted, that strange things happened near the tracks, especially at night. Curiosity got the better of me, and one evening, I decided to see for myself. The sun had just set when I arrived, the last light of day fading into the horizon. The air was cool and still, and the woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Tracks stretched out before me, rusty and uneven, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. There was something unsettling about them, feeling that they weren't as abandoned as they seemed. But I shook off the unease and began to walk along the tracks, the gravel crunching under my boots. As I walked, the air grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the night closed in. The woods seemed to press in around me, the trees forming a dark tunnel over the tracks. I could hear my own footsteps echoing in the stillness, each step louder than the last. But then I heard something else. Faint sound, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It was the unmistakable sound of a train. The rumble of wheels on steel, the shrill whistle cutting through the night. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was impossible. There hadn't been a train on these tracks in years, and yet it was unmistakable. The rumble grew louder, the whistle more insistent, and I could feel the vibrations through the ground as if a train were barreling towards me. Panic set in as I realized that whatever was coming, I was directly in its path. It turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the tracks were holding me in place. The sound of the train was deafening now, the whistle blaring, the rumble shaking the very air around me. My heart raced as I looked up, expecting to see the lights of an oncoming train, but there was nothing, just the darkness of the woods and the empty tracks stretching out before me. The noise grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the train was right on top of me. Still, I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by some unseen force. Just when I thought the train would collide with me, it happened. A flash of light, and there it was, train rushing past me at impossible speed. But this train was no ordinary locomotive. It was translucent, ghostly, as if made of mist and shadow. The windows were dark, and inside I could see shadowy figures, passengers staring out with hollow eyes. The train roared past, its ghostly form sending a chill through me that I felt in my very bones. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The rumble faded, the whistle silenced, and the night was still once more. I stood there, my heart pounding, the cold air biting at my skin, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The tracks were empty, the woods silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The ghostly train that still haunted these tracks, a remnant of a tragedy long past. The stories I had heard came rushing back to me. A tale of a train that had derailed on these very tracks, killing everyone on board. They said the train still ran its route on certain nights, its ghostly passengers trapped in an endless journey, unable to find peace. I had never believed it. But now, standing alone on the tracks, I knew the truth. The haunted train was real, and I had come face to face with it. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, the sound of my footsteps loud in the stillness. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness thicker, the air colder. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I didn't stop until I was back in town. The lights of the street lamps, a welcome sight. But the memory of the haunted train tracks stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the ghosts that still linger in the places we least expect. The weather had been strange all day, oppressively hot and humid, kind of day where the air feels heavy and thick, like something was about to happen. By late afternoon, the sky had turned an ominous shade of green, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees with an unnatural force. I knew something was wrong, and when the sirens started blaring, warning of an approaching tornado, my heart sank. I'd lived through storms before, but this one felt different, more powerful, more dangerous. I barely had time to react before the tornado was upon us. The wind roared like a freight train, shaking the walls of my house as I scrambled for cover. I grabbed my emergency kit and ran to the basement, the sound of the storm growing louder with each passing second. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Only light came from the small window near the ceiling, which showed the sky swirling with debris. As I huddled in the corner, the wind outside reached a deafening pitch, rattling the walls and sending shivers down my spine. The entire house seemed to shudder as the tornado passed overhead, its force threatening to tear everything apart. I closed my eyes, praying that the basement would hold, that I would survive the storm. But then, through the noise, I heard something else. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, and listened. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, calm and reassuring, telling me to stay where I was, that I would be safe. It felt like a dream. The fear in my chest was real, and the voice brought an odd sense of comfort in the chaos. I clung to that voice, focusing on it as the storm raged around me, feeling a strange connection to it. Suddenly, the house groaned, and I felt the floor beneath me shift. The tornado was tearing through everything in its path, and I could feel the pressure building, as if the entire house was about to be ripped from its foundation. The voice grew louder, more insistent, urging me to stay put, to trust it. I didn't know why, but I obeyed, my fear easing slightly as I followed the voice's instructions. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the tornado passed. The wind died down, the noise faded, and an eerie silence settled over the house. I could hardly believe it was over. Slowly, I climbed out of the basement, my hands shaking as I reached the top of the stairs. The house was in shambles, windows shattered, furniture overturned, and debris scattered everywhere. The walls were still standing, and I was alive. As I stepped outside, I was greeted by a scene of utter devastation. The neighborhood was unrecognizable, houses reduced to rubble, trees uprooted, cars overturned. But amid the destruction, there was something else, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. The voice that had guided me through the storm still lingered in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder where it had come from. I walked through the wreckage, my thoughts racing, when I saw her, a woman standing at the edge of what had once been my neighbor's house. She was older, with silver hair and a serene expression, and she was looking straight at me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized she looked familiar, like someone I had seen before but couldn't quite place. I started to approach her, but before I could say a word, she smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and vanished before my eyes. I stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The woman was gone, leaving no trace behind, but I knew what I had experienced was real. She was the voice I had heard in the basement, a presence that had guided me through the storm. I later learned that my neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived alone, passed away years ago in the same house that was now reduced to rubble. The tornado was a force of nature, destructive and terrifying, but what I experienced that day was something beyond explanation. The voice that saved me, the woman who appeared in the aftermath, it was as if she had returned to protect me, ensure that I survived. The memory of that day, and the voice that guided me, remains a chilling reminder that sometimes, in our darkest moments, we're not as alone as we think. The mountains had always been a place of solace for me, a sanctuary where I could escape the chaos of life and find peace in the rugged beauty of nature. That day, the weather was perfect for a hike. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the scent of pine in the air. I set out early, eager to explore a new trail that wound its way through the forest and up into the rocky cliffs. The trail was steep, but the views were worth it, each turn revealing more of the breathtaking landscape. I was halfway up the mountain when I heard it. A low rumble, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I stopped in my tracks, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end as the ground beneath me began to shake. A landslide. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I turned to run, but it was too late. The mountainside gave way with a deafening roar, and I was caught in the midst of it, the world around me collapsing into chaos. The force of the landslide was overwhelming, the ground buckling and shifting under my feet as rocks and debris rained down around me. I tried to find shelter, but the avalanche of earth and stone was relentless, sweeping me off my feet and burying me in an instant. The world went dark, the weight of the earth pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I was trapped, buried alive, no way to escape. Panic set in as I struggled to breathe, my chest heaving with the effort to draw in air. Pressure was immense, the darkness suffocating, and I could feel the earth closing in around me. My mind raced, searching for a way out. There was nothing, no light, no air, just the cold, crushing weight of the mountain. I was alone, buried deep in the earth, and the terror of it all threatened to consume me. But then, as I lay there, something miraculous happened. I felt a shift in the earth, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if something was giving way. My hand brushed against something solid, a root, thick and gnarled, buried deep in the soil. I clung to it, desperate for anything that might help me escape. The root felt like a lifeline, and I pulled with all my strength, the earth loosening its grip just enough for me to move. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to dig my way out, using the root as a guide, pulling myself towards what I hoped was the surface. The air was thin, each breath a struggle, but I refused to give up. The thought of being buried alive, of of never seeing the light of day again, drove me forward, inch by inch, through the dark, suffocating soil. My fingers were numb, my body battered and bruised, but I kept going, the route leading me closer to freedom. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it. Faint glimmer of light, just above me. Clawed at the earth, my hands raw and bleeding, until I broke through the surface, gasping for air as the sunlight flooded in. The relief was overwhelming, the sky above me a brilliant blue, air fresh and cool. I lay there for a long time, too exhausted to move, the memory of the darkness still clinging to me. When I finally pulled myself to my feet, I looked down at the root that had saved me. It was thick and twisted, its surface worn smooth by time, and I realized then that it wasn't just any root. It was the root of an ancient tree, one that had stood on the mountainside for centuries. The tree's roots had anchored me, pulled me back from the brink of death, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a stroke of luck. The mountains had always been a place of solace for me, but now they held a new significance, a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything, and how something as simple as a tree's root saved my life. The memory of being buried alive, of the darkness and the crushing weight of the earth, is a chilling one, but it's also a testament to the resilience of life, to the unexpected ways we find our way back to the light. Driving at night had never bothered me. In fact, I often found it calming. The roads were quiet, world around me still, and it gave me time to think. That night, the rain had been relentless, turning the streets into rivers and making visibility nearly impossible. But I had driven in worse conditions, so I kept going, the wipers working overtime as I navigated the slick roads. The storm showed no signs of letting up, the sky dark and angry, the rain pounding against the roof of the car like a drumbeat. The road I was on was a familiar one, a shortcut I often took through the countryside to avoid the main highway. It wound through a dense forest, the trees forming a tunnel overhead, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. The rain was coming down harder now, and the road was becoming more treacherous, the water pooling in the low spots and creating large puddles that splashed up against the sides of the car. Suddenly, I felt the car skid, the tires losing traction on the slick road. My heart leaped into my throat as I tried to regain control, but it was too late. The car veered off the road, sliding down an embankment and into a small, swollen river. The impact was jarring, the water rushing up around the car with a force that took my breath away. The car began to sink, cold water flooding in through the cracks in the doors, and panic set in as I realized the severity of the situation. I fumbled with the seatbelt, my hands trembling, my mind racing with thoughts of how to escape. The water was rising fast, already up to my waist, and the car was quickly becoming submerged. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Pressure from the water outside too great. The windows were fogging up, the cold air inside condensing as the water continued to rise. My breath came in short, frantic gasps, the realization that I was trapped sinking in. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw him. Figure standing in the rain on the embankment above, barely visible through the fogged-up window. He was tall, his features obscured by the downpour, but there was something about him that seemed out of place, almost otherworldly. He didn't hesitate, didn't wait for me to call for help. He simply dove into the water, swimming towards the car with a speed and determination that gave me a glimmer of hope. He reached the car in seconds, his hands pressing against the window as he motioned for me to move back. I did as he instructed, the water now up to my chest, cold and numbing. The man seemed to know exactly what to do, his movements swift and precise as he pulled something from his belt. A small tool, perhaps a hammer, and smashed the window with a single powerful strike. The glass shattered, the water rushing in with a force that nearly knocked me back, but I was ready, pushing myself through the broken window and into the freezing water. The man grabbed my arm, pulling me to the surface with a strength that seemed impossible. The cold air hit my face like a slap, the rain still pouring down, but I was out, I was free. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, as he dragged me to the shore, his grip firm and unyielding. We collapsed on the muddy bank, both of us soaked to the bone. The sound of the car sinking into the river behind us barely registering in my mind. I turned to thank him, to ask how he had known to help. But when I looked, he was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. The rain continued to fall, the river rushing by, but there was no sign of the man who had saved me. I called out, my voice lost in the storm, but there was no answer. It was as if he had been a ghost, a phantom who had appeared in my moment of need and then disappeared just as quickly. The memory of that night haunts me still. The image of the man's face, what little I had seen of it, burned into my mind. I never found out who he was or how he had known to help me. The police searched the area, but there were no other cars, no footprints, nothing to suggest that anyone else had been there. It was as if he had been sent by something or someone to save me from certain death. Even now, when I drive that road, I can't help but glance towards the river, half expecting to see him standing there, watching over the water. The submerged car is long gone, but the memory of that night and the man who saved me remains a chilling reminder that sometimes in our darkest moments, help comes from the most unexpected places. The old mine had been abandoned for decades, its tunnels winding deep beneath the earth like forgotten veins of a once thriving industry. It was a place of danger and mystery, and everyone in town knew to stay away. But when you grow up hearing stories about a place, the lure of it can be hard to resist. So one afternoon I found myself standing at the entrance of the mine, air thick with dust and the promise of adventure. I wasn't alone. My friends were with me, and together we decided to explore the dark, winding passages that had been left to time. The first few steps inside were unnerving, the air cool and stale, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the narrow tunnel. The walls were rough and uneven, the ceiling low enough that we had to duck in some places. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing old wooden supports that creaked with age, threatening to give way at any moment. The deeper we went, the more the weight of the earth above seemed to press down on us, the silence only broken by the occasional drip of water from the rocks. As we ventured further into the mine, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thicker with the smell of damp earth and rusted metal. The light from the entrance faded until it was nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by the dim glow of our flashlight. We came across old equipment, long since abandoned. Rusted carts, broken tools, and fragments of wood that had once been part of the mine's infrastructure. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us shifted. The mine groaned, the walls vibrating with a deep, ominous sound that sent chills down my spine. A low rumble echoed through the tunnel, and the air was suddenly filled with the sound of falling rocks. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized what was happening. The mine was collapsing. We turned to run, our feet scrambling over the uneven ground as the tunnel behind us began to cave in, the roof buckling under the weight of the earth above. The panic was overwhelming. Fear of being buried alive, driving us forward. Rocks and debris rained down around us, the sound of the collapse deafening in the confined space. I could barely see through the dust that filled the air, my flashlight flickering as the battery struggled to keep up. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the exit too far away, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet as the collapse gained momentum. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I felt it. A strong hand grabbing my arm, pulling me forward with a force that I couldn't resist. I stumbled, but the grip on my arm steadied me, guiding me through the darkness with a surety that I couldn't explain. I couldn't see who it was. My friends were ahead of me, running for their lives. The hand held on, pulling me along with a determination that kept me from falling behind. We made it out, just in time. The entrance to the mine collapsing behind us with a deafening roar as we stumbled into the open air. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The dust settled around us, and the mine was silent once more, the entrance now blocked by a massive pile of rubble. My friends were beside me, shaken but alive, and as we caught our breath, I turned to thank whoever had pulled me to safety. There was no one there. The hand that had saved me was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. My friends swore they hadn't looked back, hadn't reached out to help me. Each of them had been too focused on their own escape. I was left with the chilling realization that something, or someone, had intervened in that moment, guiding me out of the collapsing mine when I had been on the brink of being trapped forever. The experience left me shaken, haunted by the memory of the strong, unseen hand that had pulled me to safety. The collapsing mine is now sealed off, the town declaring it too dangerous to ever enter again. But I know that something still lingers in those dark tunnels. The presence that saved me that day, a ghost of the past perhaps, or something more, is a reminder that some places hold secrets far older and deeper than we can imagine. The ocean had always called to me, its vastness both terrifying and mesmerizing. So, when the opportunity arose for a solo sailing trip, I jumped at the chance. Plan was simple: sail from one island to another, a week of solitude on the open water, just me and the sea. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. Calm waters, clear skies, and the feeling of freedom that only the ocean can provide. But then a storm rolled in, sudden and fierce, and everything changed. The wind howled, the waves towering over my small boat as it was tossed around like a toy in the churning sea. I fought to keep control, but it was no use. The storm was too powerful. The last thing I remember was the boat capsizing, cold water pulling me under as I struggled to stay afloat. When I finally surfaced, gasping for air, the boat was gone, and I was alone in the vast expanse of the ocean, clinging to a piece of debris as the storm raged on. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. I lost track of time as I drifted. Storm eventually giving way to calm seas. Exhausted and dehydrated, I thought I was done for. Then I saw it. A small island on the horizon, a sliver of land in the endless blue. With the last of my strength, I paddled towards it, the waves pushing me closer until I finally felt the sand beneath my feet. I collapsed on the shore, grateful to be alive. The island was deserted, a small, rocky outcrop with a few palm trees and not much else. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, isolated and forgotten. There were no signs of human life, no footprints in the sand, no debris washed up on the shore. As I explored, I found a freshwater spring and enough fruit to sustain me. But the solitude was overwhelming. The silence was eerie. The only sounds, the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant crash of waves against the rocks. But it wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. It started with small things. A glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps behind me when no one was there. I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me, the result of days spent alone on the island. But the feeling grew stronger, the sense of a presence that I couldn't explain. At night, I would hear whispers on the wind, faint and indistinct, like voices carried from another time. One evening, as the sun was setting, I saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the trees watching me from a distance. He was dressed in old tattered clothes, his face shadowed by the fading light. My heart raced as I called out to him, but he didn't respond, didn't move. He just stood there, silent and still, as if he were part of the island itself. I took a step towards him, but in the blink of an eye, was gone, vanished into the trees without a trace. The encounter left me shaken, but it wasn't the last. Over the next few days, I saw him again and again, always at a distance, always watching, never coming closer. The island's isolation, once a source of peace, had become a prison, haunted by the ghostly figure that seemed to be trapped here just as I was. I began to wonder who he was, what had happened to him, and why he was still here, bound to this deserted place. Desperation set in as I realized there was no escape, no way off the island. The days blurred together, each one marked by the presence of the silent figure who watched me from the shadows. The whispers on the wind grew louder, more insistent, until they filled my mind with their haunting refrain. I knew I had to leave. The island held me in its grip, refusing to let me go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a passing ship spotted me. Crew rescued me from the island, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief as they pulled me aboard. I tried to tell them about the figure, about the presence that had haunted me, but they just shook their heads, dismissing it as the ravings of a man who had spent too long alone. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The island wasn't just deserted. It was cursed, a place where the past lingered, and the souls of the lost could never leave. Even now, back on solid ground, I can't shake the memory of that figure, the haunting eyes that watched me from the shadows. The deserted island remains a mystery, a place that holds secrets I will never understand. But one thing is certain, I will never return. The ocean may still call to me, but I know better now. Some places are better left alone, their ghosts undisturbed. I've always had a fascination with antiques. There's something about old things that carry a history, a story that draws me in. So when I found the mirror at a small, dusty shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, I couldn't resist. It was beautiful, ornately carved with intricate patterns that seemed to twist and turn like vines around the frame. The glass itself was old, slightly warped, giving it a unique character. The shopkeeper seemed eager to sell it, offering it at a price far below what I thought it was worth. I didn't think twice. I bought it on the spot. When I brought it home, I placed it in my bedroom, where it caught the light in a way that made the room feel brighter, almost alive. The mirror seemed to belong there, as if it had always been a part of the space. But almost immediately, strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle, an odd flicker of movement in the reflection, a shadow that didn't belong. I chalked it up to my imagination, convinced that I was just adjusting to the new addition. But the oddities grew more pronounced. I would catch glimpses of things in the mirror that weren't there when I turned around. A dark figure standing behind me, only to vanish when I looked back. Sometimes I would see myself in the reflection, but something would be off. A slight delay in my movements, or an expression that didn't match what I was feeling. The mirror seemed to have a life of its own, and it began to unsettle me. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a faint sound coming from the direction of the mirror. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out the words. "Come closer," it said, the voice low and hypnotic. My heart raced as I sat up, my eyes locked on the mirror. The room was dark, but the glass seemed to shimmer with a faint, eerie light. I felt a strange compulsion to obey, to approach the mirror, but every instinct screamed at me to stay away. Despite my fear, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, drawn to it by an invisible force. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The figure in the mirror wasn't me, not exactly. It was twisted, distorted, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The reflection smiled, a chilling grin that sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized that whatever was in the mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something malevolent. Panic surged through me, and I tried to step back. My feet wouldn't move. The mirror's pull was too strong, and I could feel it drawing me closer, the surface of the glass rippling like water. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with dark thoughts and images. I could see flashes of people, places, events that I had never known, but they felt real, like memories that weren't mine. The mirror was trying to claim me, to pull me into its world. With a surge of desperation, I tore myself away from the mirror, stumbling back and breaking the connection. The room returned to normal, the whispers fading into silence, but the mirror still shimmered with that eerie light, as if it were waiting for me to return. I knew then that I couldn't keep it, that it was cursed, and that its influence would only grow stronger if I let it stay. The next morning, I took the mirror back to the shop, determined to get rid of it. But when I arrived, the shop was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The building was empty, the windows boarded up, and there was no sign of the shop. I was left standing there, the cursed mirror in my hands, with no idea what to do. It felt like a weight, heavy with the darkness it carried, and I knew I had to find a way to get rid of it. I ended up taking the mirror to a remote spot, far from anyone, and burying it deep in the ground. As I covered it with earth, I felt a sense of relief, as if a great burden had been lifted. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the mirror isn't gone, that its curse still lingers, waiting for someone else to find it. The memory of those hollow eyes, that twisted smile, haunts me, a chilling reminder that some things are better left undiscovered.